Thank you. Welcome everyone to the second Housing Commission meeting for the month of February. This meeting is being held virtually based on the electronic meetings policy that the Housing Commission passed last year. And we are having a little bit of a different agenda tonight. This meeting is really fully focused on the missing middle housing topic, and we will be considering our recommendation to the county board and taking a vote on that tonight. So our agenda will first be a presentation from county staff, and then we will open it up to public comments, and then commissioners will discuss and take action. So with that, we can start with a staff presentation.
All right, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Matt Ladd with the county's planning division. And also on the call tonight from county staff, we have Kelly Brown with the planning division, Richard Tucker from the housing division, and also Russell Denow Schroeder from the housing division. And I will just pull up my slides. All right. So I'll be presenting an overview of the missing middle housing study and the draft general land use plan and zoning ordinance amendments that the county board will be considering in March. Due to the timing of this meeting tonight within our overall process, I'll not be presenting a staff recommendation tonight. That will come later in the process. And so I'll start with the general overview of the study and how we got to this point before moving on to discuss the GLUP and zoning ordinance amendments. The missing middle housing study, as I'm sure most of you know and recall, started in 2020 with the goals of increasing the county's housing supply and allowing a wider range of housing options. The study was a direct recommendation from the county's affordable housing master plan to, quote, explore flexibility in housing types and residential uses in single-family neighborhoods. The study began with a research phase to provide baseline data and an understanding of the challenges in Arlington's housing market and the history of restrictive land use in the county. Phase 1 included a full year of public engagement focused on identifying the community's priorities and concerns about expanding housing choice. Phase 2 was a focused analysis of different housing types and how they could fit into Arlington's context. This analysis informed a draft policy framework. And we're now in phase 3 of the study, which includes county board engagement and an iterative process of drafting and refining draft amendments to the general land use plan and zoning ordinance. These amendments have been informed by the community input received throughout the process. During the year-long community engagement during phase 1, we identified the key priorities and concerns shown here on the slide. The top priority from that engagement was to reduce housing costs, and we also heard many concerns about the impacts of growth and neighborhood change, which were documented in the phase 1 report. Staff released a draft policy framework for community review and input in the spring of last year. This draft was a preliminary approach for expanding housing choice that sought to address and balance the phase 1 priorities and concerns shown on the previous slide. The framework presented specific policy choices and trade-offs intended to facilitate community feedback. Following over 2 months of public engagement in phase 2, the county board held a work session and provided staff with guidance for moving into phase 3. Phase 3 began last fall with community conversations and televised information sessions with the county board. In October, staff released a first draft of the GLUP and zoning ordinance amendments, which were reviewed by the Planning Commission and its long-range planning and zoning committees, including participation from Commissioner Berkey representing this Housing Commission. And most recently, the county board took the procedural step of authorizing the advertisement of public hearings on the adoption of these amendments. This slide provides some background on that action to advertise and what it means for the process going forward. A request to advertise, or RTA, takes place prior to county board action to adopt or amend a county plan or ordinance. When the county board acts on an RTA, it's not adopting the plan or ordinance, it's only deciding whether to advertise public hearings as it did last month. Notably, the board's action last month to authorize advertisement also sets the scope of what could be adopted. The advertised draft zoning text for the missing middle housing study contains a number of different options, reflecting a range of implementation approaches. Staff is currently evaluating all of those advertised options, including considering potential policies through an equity lens. This evaluation will be included in the staff reports for next month's Planning Commission and County Board meetings. The draft zoning text has received much of the attention during Phase 3, but staff is first proposing amendments to the General Land Use Plan, also known as the GLUP. Arlington's GLUP consists of a map and booklet that describe the land use vision for the county as a whole and for distinct planning areas. The draft GLUP amendment for expanded housing options would add a new subsection to the special planning areas section of the booklet. This new section describes the overall policy goals and objectives for enabling new housing options in areas currently limited to single detached housing. The draft also acknowledges that land use policies that restrict housing options, which were adopted many decades ago, have resulted in inequities in housing opportunities. The draft GLUP amendment would encourage a wider range of housing choices for lower density residential neighborhoods that are compatible in scale and density with the existing pattern of development. The draft amendment to the GLUP booklet sets forth 3 goals for these lower density residential areas: economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and neighborhood vibrancy. On the GLUP map, the areas proposed for expanded housing options are generally located in the light yellow areas on the map, designated low residential. The draft GLUP amendment for advertisement includes one proposed update to this map. The legend for the low residential category is proposed to be updated to reflect the range of housing types that are envisioned for these areas, specifically one-family dwellings, accessory dwellings, and expanded housing options. Moving on to the draft zoning amendment, I'll be covering some of the key elements and options that are included in the advertisement. Starting with the zoning mechanism, the draft would establish a new, optional, by right development path called Expanded Housing Option Development, or EHO for short. The EHO zoning tool would provide new options for property owners and would not change the underlying zoning or the ability to build or expand one-family dwellings. As I mentioned, the advertised zoning text includes many options. These options provide the board with room to continue to refine a policy approach over the coming months, rather than being locked into a single approach. This summary chart compares the draft standards for EHO development to current standards for single detached housing. The standards listed on the left, including building height and setbacks, are the same for both housing types. For the standards listed on the right, the draft EHO standards would be stricter than the single detached standards. These standards are being considered for EHO development to address community concerns about potential impacts. Expanded housing option development would apply in all R5 to R20 zones, with 2 potential exceptions. The first is a limited number of properties that coincide with 3 planning areas defined on the GLUP map. Sites within these areas may already have land use recommendations that would allow redevelopment with more density or height than EHO through another zoning tool, such as the form-based code or site plan. The advertisement also includes the option to allow EHO development in these areas. The second exception is sites that are larger than 1 acre. These sites, also limited in number, they include institutional uses like private clubs and houses of worship. They could redevelop as multiple EHO buildings with the county board approval of a use permit. The uses allowed for EHO would be 2-family dwellings, townhouses with 3 units, or multifamily buildings with options with a maximum of 6 per site. Consistent with the county board's guidance to staff from Phase 2, the draft zoning text includes multiple options for setting minimum site area requirements. Option 2A would maintain the current site area standards for each zoning district. And as an example for 2A, the minimum site area for R6 would be 6,000 square feet, the same as it is for single detached, and R10 would be 10,000 square feet. The other 4 advertised options would allow 2 to 4 units on any site that meets the current standard for the zoning district, as I just described for 2A. These options present different approaches for setting greater site area requirements for development with 5 or 6 units. The maps on this slide compare the various site options 2B through 2E. The teal color indicates areas where housing types with up to 6 units could be allowed in each option, and the yellow areas would be limited to 4 units or fewer. These options represent a range of alternatives that reflect multiple community priorities, such as transit proximity and focusing 5 and 6 plexes on larger lots. It's probably going to advance like 3 at a time now. Thinking about it. There we go. So this slide shows the same options as the previous slide with the maps, and it estimates the total number of properties that would be eligible for different housing types, broken down by whether they're transit proximate or not transit proximate, as defined in our parking option. A range of options for setting a maximum gross floor area or the total building square footage are also included for consideration. The intent of these standards is to encourage modest-sized housing options, as well as to encourage the production of more units. The two options advertised for lot coverage would both maintain the same maximum coverage that can be achieved for a one-family dwelling today. The difference is whether a rear detached garage would be required to reach this maximum. Beyond lot coverage, other standards that determine what can be built on a site, such as height, setbacks, and the footprint of the main building, would duplicate the current single detached standards. For minimum parking requirements, there are two base options in the advertisement. Option 5A would set minimum parking requirements for transit proximate sites at 0.5 spaces per unit. Other sites would be required to provide a minimum of 1 space per unit. This could be reduced if a parking survey indicates that adequate on-street parking is available on that block. Option 5C is the same as 5A, except that transit proximate sites would not have a minimum parking requirement under 5C. The other two options could be layered on top of 5A or 5C. Moving to site layout and design, the advertised zoning text includes a number of standards that are intended to address community concerns about compatibility with existing development patterns. These standards include limits on where parking spaces can be located on a site, limits on the width of a street-facing garage wall, and requirements for the orientation and location of building entrances and requirements for screening. Another site layout standard is tree requirements. The county board advertised a range of requirements, up to 4 shade trees for development with 2 to 4 units, and up to 8 trees for a site with 5 to 6 units. For accessory dwellings, or ADs, 2 options have been advertised. Option 12A would prohibit ADs in combination with the EHO development. Option 12B would allow them in limited circumstances. First, within a townhouse or semi-detached dwelling, or second, if they are a pre-existing AD. Finally, the draft zoning text includes options to set an annual limit or cap on EHO permits. The advertised cap is up to 58 permits per year, which could be adopted with or without a sunset provision, meaning that it would no longer apply after a certain date without a subsequent zoning ordinance amendment. The advertised zoning text also includes an option not to set a cap on permits. The Missing Middle Housing Study began shortly after the county board adopted its equity resolution over 3 years ago. From its inception, the study has been grounded in equity considerations. Zoning laws that dictate which housing types are allowed within a neighborhood play a significant role in determining who can attain housing in that neighborhood. Attachment 9 of our RTA staff report includes an equity report making use of new data sets linking census, housing, and zoning data. I'll share a brief overview of that analysis on the next few slides. When thinking about equity, we start by looking at the status quo to understand the baseline for trends that are already happening within the community. In the R5 to R20 zones in Arlington today, Only 28% of residents are people of color, compared to 48% in other zoning districts. And the R5 to R20 zones have a much lower proportion of rental housing than the county average. Based on our analysis of current housing prices, only households with incomes greater than $200,000 can attain housing in these zones. Because missing middle housing options would be smaller and would share land costs, they're expected to be lower cost than current market rate housing in the R5 to R20 zones. We expect that expanded housing options could benefit households earning as low as $100,000 who are currently locked out of these neighborhoods due to high costs. In thinking about who could be burdened by expanded housing choice, we considered renters, who are the most at risk of displacement from redevelopment. If a single detached rental property is redeveloped for EHO, the tenants would need to relocate just as they would today when a teardown for a single detached house occurs. Households with incomes below the level needed to attain missing middle housing types would not benefit from the draft EHO policies without additional support or subsidy. However, this study is just one piece of the county's Housing Arlington initiative, and other efforts are focused on meeting the housing needs of low-income households, as this commission is well aware. In terms of next steps, the Planning Commission and County Board will hear the GLUP and zoning ordinance amendments at their next March meetings. Each of those meetings will include another round of public hearings. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Matthew. And we will move now to public comment. Looks like Alice Hogan is up first. Alice, are you there?
I am. Thank you. It's taking me a minute. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, commissioners and staff. Thank you all of you for all the hard work that's gone into this process over 3 years' time. Many of you may know that I was on the Housing Commission for 13 years until about a couple of years ago, and I currently work with the Alliance for Housing Solutions, which is a local nonprofit that studies and provides public education around housing policy in the county. So I just wanted to mention a few things that AHS is focused on with this proposal. We have been working on it for the past 3 years. We're very much in favor of expanding our housing options in Arlington, knowing that our supply is in desperate need of increase and that people in that middle range really cannot find what they need. And as was mentioned in the presentation, of course, we have many more opportunities and programs for folks making less than $100,000. So this is a new effort which is budget neutral for households making that that middle section of income. Although we know that's not the reason for the name of this program, but it does help folks at like almost half the income level needed in other neighborhoods. So I wanted to point out a few of the items that we were most interested in highlighting for your consideration as a commission. First off, we fully support the broadest possible ordinance to bring about new, diverse, and financially attainable housing across the county. So we applaud the work of the county staff, and we look forward to seeing what the board comes up with. First and foremost, of course, we're interested in 6 units on any lot possible because of the need for supply. And we know that the more units per building, that means that those units will, just by affordability by design, will be the least expensive among that. So that's the lower on that income scale that we can help folks attain housing, whether it be rental or homeownership in neighborhoods that are currently very closed. We're also interested in 2A, the most flexibility on any lot. 4B, allowing that 5% bonus that typically goes to garages to be put towards housing itself. 5C and E, minimal to no parking requirement, because every time we ask for a paved spot on a lot, we're preventing more housing on that spot. And individual homeowners can determine whether or not their spot needs needs parking. And we're opposed to the cap, of course, knowing that we need supply. So thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Up next, we have Jason Schwartz.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Schwartz. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Jason Schwartz, and I sent everyone a really super long PDF with slides showing why I support missing middle housing, talking about the housing crisis, the environment, transportation, density, equity and justice, parking, housing type supply, gentrification and displacement. But I just really kind of want to share, again, personal story. Before moving to Arlington, I lived in missing middle housing for 6 years. And the missing middle housing enabled me over those 6 years to save over $16,000 by not having to pay for amenities that I didn't need to pay for. Elevator, concrete construction, parking garage, gym, rooftop, all those sort of things. It enabled me to stay in neighborhoods that I would have had to pay significantly more otherwise if I wanted to be in an apartment complex. So that housing opportunity really enabled me to personally thrive. And I lived in 3 different places that had missing middle housing, in suburban settings, in an urban core adjacent setting, and in an urban core. So the missing middle housing is great in all sorts of housing typologies. It doesn't necessarily need to be an area that's already walkable. Having a house when I was living in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, it was in a suburb and it wasn't very walkable, but it still provided cheaper housing than the single family alternative. So it's been really great. And in my experience living in missing middle housing, it's really great because I lived in missing middle housing that was built in the 2000s, that was built in the beginning of the at the turn of the 19th century, and also all the way back in the turn of the 18th century. So 3 different centuries of housing that I've lived in. And it's just been amazing to me because I value living in diverse neighborhoods where people of different incomes can live together. People that are more wealthy, they can certainly live in a larger house, and people that are um, less wealthy, or they can live in a smaller place. The thing is to have choice and options, because that's opportunity directly for me. I'm here in Arlington because of all the opportunities it provides, and I want to hopefully stay here, and I want to make sure as many people can stay here as possible so that they don't have to move further out or live in substandard housing conditions. So again, my full information is on the slides that I sent. I'm not going to go over those, but thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak, and I hope to see missing middle pass without any more further reductions in opportunity for me, myself, and others. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Up next, we have Patrick Garospi. I don't know if I said that last name correctly, but
yeah, you did. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I don't think I can beat Jason with his PDF or Alice with all of her good talking points. But I'm a resident of Arlington. I live in the Boston, Virginia Square area. And just coming out tonight to speak in favor of the missing middle housing study. Overall, as Alice mentioned, like the issue's been studied for 3 years now, very thoroughly. And if you take all the parts that Matt presented, which there are many parts of the study and lots of different options, overall the proposal is quite modest. It's basically a market-driven approach to help alleviate shortages in our housing supply. It provides homeowners and property owners and prospective homeowners and prospective renters with options besides, McMansion teardowns, which is, the only option in Arlington for 75% of the land on our county. So, ultimately the government is, and all the rules and all the regulations and the red tape are the root of our housing crisis, or one of the core causes. So I'm coming out to speak in favor of reducing those and, you know, enabling this by right permitting process with as least restrictions as possible. You know, we don't need floor area requirements. You know, we don't need unnecessary parking minimums, and we certainly, in you know, an age of a housing shortage and a housing crisis and a houselessness crisis, adding caps to housing. It's quite absurd if you step back and think about it. Now, missing middle housing isn't a panacea. You know, it's a very modest proposal, but it's a good first step. You know, the staff's done a lot of work studying it. All the commissions, including yourself, thank you for all your work. You know, everyone's been studying and talking about it, but you know, I ask that this commission, this housing commission, the one of many commissions, recommend the widest EHO option, least red tape, and the most flexibility. So 6 units, you know, no floor area restrictions, and where at all possible, no parking requirements. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my comments, and I wish you luck in your consideration of this proposal.
Thank you, Patrick. Next up, we have Adam Theo.
Good evening. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, my big concern right now is with the economics of building missing middle housing. Even if we technically allow up to 6 units, it doesn't do us any good if there are so many restrictions on them or unfair advantages remaining with single family homes, so as to make building missing middle housing too difficult and expensive. So it's critical that we maximize the amount of space for people and not for cars, please. Make sure that the lot coverage allowances take space for a detached garage, which won't be allowed in missing middle housing in most cases anyway, and add it instead to the main housing building. Even just the noted 5% extra can make a big difference in making everything from duplexes to sixplexes much more viable. So please, let's support 4B. And at the very least, eliminate parking minimums on lots near transit. Ideally, we'd be eliminating parking minimums countywide, like many growing jurisdictions are doing right now. It's unfortunate that Arlington, long known for its forward-thinking, transit-oriented development, has not been leading in this issue. Ideally, I'd love for elimination of parking minimums. And also, just FYI, whoever is screen sharing and writing an email, it is broadcasting. But yeah, ideally we'd be eliminating parking minimums countywide, but at the very least, eliminate them for parcels, lots near transit. In short, with our land being at such a premium, we should really be using it efficiently by allocating as much as possible to people and not cars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Next, we have Michelle Winters.
Hello, everybody. Can you guys hear me?
Yep,
Hello?
we can hear you.
Okay, good. So I'm very excited to be supporting this ordinance tonight, and I do have some detailed comments to give you. A lot more than what I can cover in 3 minutes, though, so I'll be fast. So first of all, the lot size tiering, like others have said, you know, now that we've gotten rid of the 7 and 8 units out of the proposal, it seems like there's really not much of a drawback to going with the option 2A, which is no tiering required, just allowing up to 6 units everywhere. And in reality, you would be limiting, there would be limitations on the number of units on smaller lots, just because of the other parameters. But the few cases where these could be built wouldn't be prohibited. So if option A is not the preferred option, though, there are some specific issues that you really need to look at closely in the other options. The first is the definition of transit proximity, which in option E was added. When that was added, it was changed to be a much more limited definition. that basically wipes out most of North Arlington from the definition of transit proximate. And I think that's a huge red flag. So please be careful with anything evolving around that. And actually, I don't think that there is any need for any transit proximity rules if we allow 6 everywhere with other parameters. The second issue is what's allowed on non-conforming lots. This has really not gotten much attention. Option 2A's non-conforming language would allow, in the way that I read it, any size non-conforming lot to have up to 6 units. That's consistent with how 1-unit homes are treated in these districts, basically grandfathering in old lots so that they can be built on regardless of their area or width. It looks to me like all the other options limit non-conforming lots everywhere to only 4 units, or 5 to 6 units with larger lot sizes depending on the option. So this means that undersized non-conforming lots of 8,000 or 9,000 square feet in some zones would be limited to 4 units in most cases. Some of these lots are pretty big, just not big enough for their zoning district. So I think that this is something that you need to watch out for in looking at any of those other options. Looking at the gross floor area limits in option 11, the gross floor area limits are pretty complicated. So I think that basically if you go with them, it might be better to go, if you're interested in them, it might be better to go with them for a few years because it would be easier to remove the limits than to add them later. I also think that you should avoid putting on the design limitations such as the garage width, screening, and building entrance location requirements because those are over limiting for this housing type. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Next up, we have Terry.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, sorry, I only found out about this today, but I see this discussion is hugely slanted toward the pro missing middle side. I am not on that side. I live in a single family neighborhood with very small lots. Most of the area are very small houses. No house at all in our neighborhood is over 5,000 square feet. And of that amount, there are very few. So to say that 6,000 square feet, an 8,000 square feet building would fit in to a neighborhood is, you're clearly not looking around if that's what you believe. If you also believe that people don't have cars because they live near a bus route or the metro, clearly you need to be driving around Arlington because this is not the case. The people that live and I live near Columbia Pike, a block, every single person has 2 cars. Every single house, the people that live in the townhouses, the people that live in the apartments, everybody has cars. So for you to push the burden of, you don't want cars parked on your properties, and instead you want to push the burden onto the neighborhood streets is a disservice to people who live in Arlington. And lastly, I kind of feel like when I hear people saying bigger, more, don't limit the floor area, don't limit reduce the setbacks. Clearly, these are not people who are going to make good neighbors because they don't live in the neighborhood and they don't seem to care that other people don't want this. And then on what street do you think six units is 18 trash cans? Where do you think that's going to fit? On what street? I just don't understand this conversation. It's grossly one-sided, and you want to talk about equity, you're not listening to the population that does not agree with this. And you're not willing to make any concessions, and you keep pushing people, and families are fighting, and not so much neighbors, because most people don't agree with this policy that own a home. And I tell you, I've been asking, and in the blocks where I live, maybe 2 or 3 people per block support this. So you're way out of what the scope of reality is. And this is honestly kind of embarrassing. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I think that concludes our public comment. And now we will go into the commission discussion. So I would like to just sort of set some parameters, or at least get confirmation. So my understanding is, and staff, please correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially there's 10 different options that we can either choose to support. Well, 10 different questions that some have multiple options and some are binary, or and some just have one, that we can either take a position on, not take a position on, or select one of the options. And then we also have the GLUP amendment that we could support or not take a position. Is that accurate? Am I missing any of the potential options?
Yes, I think that's generally accurate. What you can do in terms of the zoning ordinance amendment, since there are multiple options advertised, you can recommend whatever is within the scope of what the county authorized for advertisement.
Yep.
And then the GLUP amendment is a little simpler because there aren't options.
Okay. Eric, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm wondering if the way to approach this would be, because there's actually, Matt, there's 12 options that were advertised along with the GLUP amendments. I wonder if the way to approach this is we could go through all 12, or Colin, you could ask folks to basically put things on the table, because we don't have, as Matt was saying, we don't have to necessarily provide recommendations on every single option. I would lean towards asking folks, like the Planning Commission does, asking folks to put things they want to discuss on the table, and then we can go through one by one. That's my proposal.
Okay. I did want to get clarification though. If you're saying there's 12, what are 8 and 9?
Okay, so 8 and 9, I didn't include in my presentation, and I can go over them. One is 8. It has to do with pretty limited circumstances, and it's if you have a non-conforming building and you want to convert it to from rental property to condominium. Currently, we require a use permit in that circumstance, so the option would be to continue to require a use permit to convert a non-conforming building from rental to ownership, or we could take away that requirement so you could just do it by right. And then 9 has to do with the definition of a duplex, and it's just a proposal to change the definition of a duplex, which currently says that you can only have one front door, and also has some kind of subjective language as, it has to look like a one-family house.
Okay. And how many options are within 9? Or is it just one?
It's either 9 is just either change the definition of a duplex or keep it the same,
or not?
where you can only have one front entrance.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. If you're not speaking, if you could go on mute. It looks like, oh, there we go. Thank you. So I just wanted to provide some remarks to the commission myself first. I am very supportive of the most expansive options for missing middle. I think very much this is an equity-driven change, and we have large parts of the county, essentially 75%, that have been closed off to a lot of people, historically people of color, and the issues around generational wealth and around the differences in income levels that persist to this day have made it even harder for, definitely hard for residents of color and other historically disadvantaged groups to buy into single family home neighborhoods. Missing middle is, I think, a good first step to righting some of those wrongs. It's certainly not going to solve the housing crisis, supply crisis that we have, or the affordable housing crisis that we have in Arlington. But it gives us some options that are market rate. It doesn't cost Arlington County any money to do this, which I think is important. Although there's a lot of other solutions that do cost county money that I think are also very important and should be considered as part of a separate conversation. But I think that going for the most expansive options that are still on the table is my preference. And I have specific positions for each of the different items except for 8 and 9. I had not developed a specific position yet on those, but happy to entertain that discussion with other commissioners who have given that some more thought. And I also, I would like to propose to the commission that we include in our letter, and if anyone disagrees, please let me know, our disappointment that the county board removed 7 and 8 plexes from the request to advertise, because as I said at the last meeting, we were not given a chance to weigh in on that before they made the decision to exclude 7 and 8s. I think that 7 and 8s were an important piece of this that's no longer on the table. I don't think that that should be a central part of our letter, but I do think it's important to state that the Housing Commission wasn't given an opportunity to provide our advice to the county board before they made that very important decision, and we're disappointed in that action. So with those kind of general statements, happy to entertain discussion from other commissioners. As Eric said, if people want to propose certain ones, I'm happy to go through sort of starting with 1, 2, 3, 4. We can go down. We can have staff put up the PowerPoint slide relevant to each set of options so that people have that on the screen that they can refer to, if that would be helpful. That is kind of my preferred way to do this, is kind of throw up the slide on the screen and then have discussion on that. Laura?
There we go. What you just suggested about having the slide up on the screen so we can see what a specific option entails, please do that. I strongly support that, because even though I studied this, it's a lot to page through and to try to remember off the top of our head. So that would be great. That's my one plea.
Sounds good. Thank you. And thank you, Matthew, for putting that up. Nikki, you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Kellen. I don't.
Oh, looks like is that Doris? There we go. Muted. Go ahead, Nikki.
Thanks. Yeah, I think your idea of how to go about this sounds great, and I agree with Commissioner Lara. I just want to say that I do think that our letter should actually, you said it doesn't have to be a large part of our letter, but I think we shouldn't minimize it. I'm new to the commission, but if I'm understanding our charge correctly, it's quite literally our charge to advise the county, and they denied us of that opportunity. So I do think we need to be forceful in our statements on how disappointed we are, and I don't think it should be minimized.
Thank you, Nikki. Definitely in agreement. Any other general comments before we dig into the specific areas? Okay. So starting with the first, so the maximum number of units per site. So essentially, this is deciding how dense we want it to be. So my preference is to go up to 6 plexes. Again, this is still based off of fitting into the same footprint that we currently have for single-family homes when it comes to lot coverage and the setbacks required. So that doesn't change. It's just how many families you can house on the same footprint that you would have had for a single family home. Discussion over or how people are thinking. people also support sixplexes or if you support something different. Sarah.
Yes, I support that. Like, I mean, if the number of units fits that lot, then why not? And again, you mentioned before, this is for 75% of Arlington is single family homes. Cool. And I think that's been discussed many times. That's only zoned for single family homes. So I say why not? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I saw Laura's hand up next.
Yes, thank you. I support the maximum number of 6 that's left to us under this RTA. Would have preferred 8. I'm okay with 6.
Thank you, Laura. And let's see, Margaret, your hand is also up.
Yeah, I would support the 6 and just comment that coming from living in one of the single family neighborhoods as a homeowner and watching McMansions go up all around me, whose footprints are probably doubling or tripling the size of my home. I would much rather see 6 families live in that size property than see one family live in those ginormous properties. So I think if we're sticking with existing footprints and setbacks and such, then what's the difference? So and I echo the effort to put in some notation regarding that we could go up to the 7 and 8, because again, if we're using this same concept, it's going to be market driven. So
thank you, Margaret. I think I saw Eric's hand up, but I think you may put it back down.
Yeah, I'll wait because I want to speak to option 2.
Okay. Any other comments on the first option, the maximum number of units per site? It sounds like we generally have consensus on sixplexes. Okay. Option 2, minimum site area. So for this one, my preference is 2A, which does not limit it just to transit areas. I think 2E is I'm very much against that one. I think it basically puts large swaths of North Arlington, the wealthiest parts of our community, and some of the largest lots, and says that they're not going to be subject to the densest potential development. So for me, 2A would be my preferred option. Eric?
Thanks, Kellen. I think this is maybe the most important thing we're going to talk about is this option 2. As Kellen, as you were indicating, this minimum site area really does seem to be one of the most important drivers of how effective this proposal could be to providing greater housing options and opportunity in the market. And so some background and first off, Matt and Kelly and Richard and Anne and Anthony and everybody who's worked on this at the staff level, I just, my immense gratitude for all your work over these last 3 years. And there's many, many more folks beyond that. So option 2 is really important, right? And so we began with options 2A and 2B, and then it kind of evolved from there because some board members wanted to talk about potentially looking at sites being this transit proximate, definition. And then, we got 2E from board member DeFerrante at the last, at the RTA, and that was included. I find option 2A incredibly, I find option 2E incredibly problematic. It's not supported by a whole lot of analysis. It wasn't included as a result of the consultant analysis. It very clearly, in my opinion, seems to cut against a lot of the equities we've talked about in expanding housing opportunities because, as Kellen was saying, essentially you're limiting a lot of the lots, especially those north of Langston Boulevard, because they're either not going to meet the definition of being transit proximate or they're not going to be 12,000 square feet. It's a very, very large lot. And so instead of having a plan that really moves towards equity, we're really doing something here with option 2E that moves away from that equity goal. I feel very strongly that this should not have been on the table at all. I do concur with the idea that option 2A is likely the strongest option because it's the most straightforward and it does duplicate the same as the zoning district standard. And so what that means, again, and I'm not trying to talk down to folks, but this is kind of complicated stuff, is right that like that doesn't mean that you could build a sixplex on any residential lot in Arlington. You still have to look at the different residential zone, R5, R6, R20, whatever it is. But we basically would be hugging a lot of those standards in 2A. So you couldn't actually build a sixplex everywhere. A lot of that would still be fairly restricted. But you also are restricted and if you can build a single family house and how big that can be in a lot of parts of Arlington as well. So I think that's the most robust option. We could secondarily recommend 2D. It's very similar to 2A. It's a little bit more restrictive for 5 and 6 units, but otherwise, because 7 and 8 units are off the table, it's a 95% version of option 2A. And then, like I said, 2B is still incredibly restrictive for those higher unit sizes, the 5s and 6s, which, the consultant analysis at least suggests maybe on the more attainable end as far as folks being able to get into them from a financial end. And 2C is also problematic because, as Michelle Winters was indicating, what is transit proximate is incredibly arbitrary. And I know that this won't be universally agreed, but I think this day and age in 2023, with the way our transit networks operate and how we're building out bus systems and everything that the county's doing, I would argue that the entirety of our county is transit proximate. And so I think this is completely inapplicable for such a kind of a emerging, urban municipality as Arlington. That was very long-winded. I will now cede the floor, but I would strongly urge us to lead into option 2A.
Thank you, Eric. If you're able to speak, Doris, if you're there on the phone. Yep.
Yes, go ahead now.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to take the time on behalf of the Disability Commission to note that, one, these proposals do not take into account accessibility of the housing that that will be planning as part of the missing middle. It appears to be taken for granted that there isn't even going to be a requirement under the Fair Housing Act amendments of 1988. But we would assert to you that there is, because once there are 4 or more units, either for rent or for purchase, then they must be accessible, compliant with the accessibility standards of the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. And we would like to suggest that the commission, as it goes forward with this, and if it approves, if it has a recommendation to approve, that there be language in there that says that the Housing Commission recommends that language be in the missing middle that assures that the new missing middle housing must be compliant with the Fair Housing Amendments Act. Also, I want to ask the staff in the Affordable Housing Master Plan, there was to have been a we were supposed to be trying to get the county board to approve zoning amendments so that among these different types of housing, that there would be the option for increasing the number of people who could live in a single family dwelling for people with significant disabilities, for example, physical disabilities, young people who might want to live on their own and share a house, but not necessarily a group home, certainly not a licensed group home, but to share an accessible house. And we would like to know if that zoning amendment is part of this or should have been part of this, or whether it's already been done separately. And the other thing that I want to reflect back to the Fair Housing Act amendments is if people or developers are buying property and building missing middle housing that is covered under the Fair Housing Act, then, and they're for rent or even for purchase, will there be common areas? One of the things that brought this to mind was the discussion earlier about parking, and parking would be an amenity. These amenities, walkways between these houses, and other common areas need to be fully accessible, and certainly that means there also needs to be some percentage of the parking offered that is accessible to disabled drivers. These are the comments that I have, and I appreciate, Mr. Chair, that you've allowed me to make them.
Thank you, Doris. And staff, if you could actually respond to both well, it's kind of two, maybe three questions from Doris. First about the Fair Housing Act and its applicability to potentially fourplexes or more. And I mean, definitely my understanding would be that Arlington County cannot supersede federal law. So if federal law applies, it applies, but still having a response from staff about any considerations for that in the planning process here, as well as the second question that she had directly asked for staff input. And then I think also the accessibility when it comes to like parking and like the ability, to access the units for people with disabilities.
And the interiors as well.
Okay.
And the other thing though is that I want to note is that in the form-based code for Columbia Pike, there were requirements for even if you built one house or a couple of townhouses, there was requirements for adaptable housing, meaning as defined in the state building code, so that the first floor would have a zero threshold entrance and primarily accessibility similar to the Fair Housing Act on the interior as well as walkways and such. So my other suggestion to this commission is that we advance also a requirement like that because it's already been used in the Columbia Pike form-based code.
Thank you, Doris. I don't know who from staff is taking that response.
So I'll start with the Fair Housing Act and the accessibility, and then I think I'll turn it over to Russell Denow Shorter, who can address some of the other aspects related to the Affordable Housing Master Plan. So Ms. Ray is correct that buildings with 4 or more units must comply with the Fair Housing Act's design and construction requirements, and that would apply to all ground floor units or all units if the building has an elevator. I don't think we're expecting to see a lot of elevator buildings given the height and the type of construction, but at least in a fourplex or more, the accessibility requirements would kick in for the ground floor units. And that includes things like accessible building access or entrance on an accessible route, accessible and usable public and common use areas. I know that was a question that Ms. Ray had. The doors have to be usable by a person in a wheelchair. There needs to be an accessible route into and through the unit, switches and controls in accessible locations, and those types of design features. So they're not in our zoning ordinance amendment because they're already federal law. And I'll turn it over to Russell to answer the other question.
Thank you, Matt. As far as the recommendation or policy in the Affordable Housing Master Plan to allow for flexibility in the definition of a family for households and for occupancy purposes in the zoning, this is something that it is on the work plan for the planning department. I know last year, the planning director, each year there's a work session with the planning director and the county board where they go over their work session for the upcoming year. Last year that was on there, but was on kind of the second tier, and they haven't gotten to that second tier. It's also was included again as a recommendation for upcoming land use zoning work in the Affordable Housing Master Plan implementation framework that the manager put forward in March of last year. So it still is on our radar. It's work that's pending and yet to be done, but not forgotten about. And we hope that we can get to that sooner rather than later. But again, that's going to be contingent on a number of factors and capacities within the planning division.
Isn't this the perfect time to do it, though, when there's going to be a change in the zoning?
Yes, that amending the zoning ordinance, we had discussed this, I think, early in the process, but when we were doing the scope for this, that was not included in the scope. We had some discussions around it, but the scope was limited really to the building form. And so, it will be a separate study at a future date.
And Doris, I just want to add for that too, that is part of the recommendations in the Regional Fair Housing Plan for Arlington County. So presumably if the board is adopting that in a couple months, then that would lead to, I would assume, a directive to staff to, figure out how to make this change in the zoning ordinance because they've already approved it as a goal. Eric, thank you, Doris. And thank you, staff, for the answers to those questions. Eric, did you have more comments on this one?
I have a question. First off, didn't recognize Russell when I was thanking people before. So Russell, also, you've been with the department for a while, so I really appreciate all your work going back to the master plan and all the work you did on that. I do have a question about so 2A, 2D. Maybe this is either for Matt or Russell. Could you just contextualize and explain the differences between the two? Obviously with the 5 and 6 plexes, the lot coverage is a little bit, the requirements are a little bit more onerous for option 2D. But then Michelle Winters was also making the point about there's a difference as far as kind of non-conforming structures and the impact of that between 2A and 2D, 2A allowing them and 2D
right,
not.
So 2A, right, we don't have a map for 2A because everything would be teal.
Right.
But I think, as you pointed out correctly, just because every lot would be eligible for a sixplex under 2A doesn't mean that every lot would result in a sixplex, and you need a significant amount of square footage to be able to support both 6 units and some amount of parking. Whether it's 1 space per unit or something less. So it's really, we've looked at this, and unless there's significant parking reductions, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to fit 6 units on 5,000 square feet, for example. And we shared some of that work with ZOCO, the Planning Commission Zoning Committee, back in the fall. And I believe it's in the RTA staff report to see some of those site diagrams that we put out. So 2D really sort of sets a threshold of 6,000 square feet for a sixplex, and I think even that probably would require, in most cases, parking less than 6 parking spaces in order to achieve that. But it does recognize that probably on the smallest sites in the county, it's not really feasible for 5,000 square or for a 5,000 square foot lot or less than 6,000 square feet to actually result in a sixplex. And so it's not a great loss to take that off the table in 2E, or I'm sorry, in 2D. And to your other question about the nonconformities, basically it does get a little complicated, but basically the approach to nonconformities is if you meet whatever and I'll go back to the previous slide if I can, if you meet whatever the standard is, and you're still, even if you're non-conforming, so if you were to look at the 2D for an example, right? If you were a non-conforming lot, let's say you were R6, where the minimum site area is 6,000 square feet, but you don't meet the width requirements. Your lot is 58 feet wide instead of 60 feet wide, and therefore you're non-conforming. If you're a legally non-conforming lot, which means that your lot was legal at the time it was created, and then through subsequent changes to the zoning, it became not in conformance, you would be able to access under 5D if you had the 6,000 square feet. I know that's probably hard to follow. I can try to restate it a little more clearly.
I mean, it's like very too simply put is that 2A just provides more flexibility because not all lots are, we have a lot of irregularly shaped lots. They might meet the size requirements, Matt, but they might not meet some of the other requirements. But if they were legal at the time that like it was set, then there's some wiggle room under 2A, less so under 2D.
Yeah, I think that, with the non-conformities, they provide more flexibility rather than less.
Okay.
The way that those are set up, so that if you had a if you had a non-conforming R10 lot, and we went with 2D, that lot could be much smaller than 10,000 square feet. And if it's a legally non-conforming lot, you could still build 5 or 6 units under 2D.
Okay. I'm still not totally understanding, but I don't want to keep belaboring the point. I appreciate that. Kellen, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you. I think, Eric, I know you had said that you were supporting 2A, but you could also see supporting 2D if the board didn't want to go for 2A. My preference is for the commission, and again, if people disagree, please speak up, to just go with this is what we recommend. If the board doesn't agree with our recommendation, and I think especially like if we recommend 2A, logically they could probably assume that 2D would be the second choice, based off of the reasoning in the letter as to why we would support 2A. But if people disagree and feel like we should basically say, like, if you don't go with our first choice, here's our second choice, I'm open to that discussion. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I mean, I would, so what I would propose, I mean, and if we think there's consensus, maybe we don't need to vote until the end, but I would propose that we lean into 2A as you're suggesting, Kellen, but I would also like to include language in the letter that explains, and again, I don't want this to all come from me, but I have a lot of concerns about 2E, 2C, 2B, and I also would like to affirmatively explain, because it seems to me that wherever the board lands, it probably isn't going to just be 2A or 2E or whatever. It's probably still going to be a little bit of a hybrid of some of these options. And so I think it would be helpful for the Housing Commission to explain why they favor certain options and why we don't favor other options, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think our letter shouldn't just be, we support 2A next. It'll, definitely go into detail about why we support this, and for the ones where it makes sense, why we don't support some of the other options. But do we have other comments from commissioners on this one? Are people generally in support? Oh, go ahead, Laura.
I just wanted to support contextualizing the preference for 2A, and then explaining in some way, like some context, the problems that we have with the other options. So I'm leaning towards, I guess, what Eric was suggesting, leading with what you suggest, Kellen, because by all means, I'm strongly for 2A for all the reasons that have been discussed over the last several minutes. But I don't want to leave the board members guessing, or like, well, if we had the housing commissioner here, commission, we'd ask them why not XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
I think at the risk of a longer letter and a little bit more editing, that we should provide the thinking just so they don't have to guess. That's it.
That makes sense. Thank you, Laura. And I just opining a bit further on this one, I think this is especially important, as Eric had mentioned, because this is really about opening up most of Arlington to people who've never had the opportunity to live in those parts of Arlington, and that it's trying to lessen the restriction based on wealth, and say, people who are making with sixplexes, between 100,000 and maybe 150,000, that homeownership, can be in reach for you too, in places of the county that they never would have had the option to live. In school, school districts, not school districts, but school zones that they previously may not have had access to. So I think this is incredibly important to open up as much of the county as we can to people who traditionally have been excluded from living in those areas. Margaret, go ahead.
And I would just encourage, I think I saw Paul Brown is with us. Yes. And I know that in prior discussions, he had rendered what I thought to be a very useful perspective from the developer side of things. And so, I'm encouraging him to pipe up on any of these things, because I do anecdotally think that, regardless of what restrictions or flexibility we put on this, it's going to be market driven to some extent. And so I'm not sure I have a perfect sense of the market, but it would be useful to know, to have that perspective of, because if we go through all of this and we make it so restrictive that, that developers continue to just do McMansions, then we've failed. So I want to try and make sure that we are walking the balance, but I'm also acutely aware that there are many homeowners within the county that are very distressed by this. So I'm trying to walk that balance of doing the right thing, but also making sure that what we do is achieves what we're wanting it to do.
Thank you, Margaret, and I am willing to recognize Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you. I would not profess any expertise in market rate or homeownership development, but I do believe strongly that providing the most flexibility and most opportunities for development will yield the best result and the greatest outcome. So I agree with what everybody has said, that 2A is by far the most attractive option, and 2D is probably acceptable in my mind. And I think we recognize the practicalities that 6-unit buildings are just not going to happen in on the smallest lots, and that's fine in my mind. So my earlier comments were largely about earlier suggestions, which I think have gone away. For instance, setting unit size maximums, and I thought that was a bad idea. I think we want to give developers as much flexibility as possible so that they can use their creativity and produce the housing we need. So that's all I have to offer right now.
Thank you, Paul. And it looks like Sarah has her hand up.
Hi, yes. I also would like to just put my support against the most flexibility that we can offer, yes, to developers and also current homeowners as well, because there is discussion about, aging in place and multi-generational homes. And so if we give them, developers and current homeowners in certain areas, I think that would be helpful. And I'm speaking for myself. We do not think market rates homes, these still might be expensive, but there will be more options available. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Any other comments? Oh, Eric, your hand is up. Eric, not hearing anything from you, but you went off mute.
That. All right, computer issues, right? So Margaret and Paul remind me of something that was talked about at the zoning committee, which is the subcommittee of planning commission that I attended several meetings back in the fall. There was a discussion of basically like, once we pass this, like, how do we jumpstart the market? Like, how do, basically, do we get developers or we get folks to come in and do we want to encourage them to do things, right? And that's been a lot of the tension of this whole study, is like providing opportunities, but then like, people, it's private actors making choices. And so I don't know that the staff ever went out to do this study to really solve that problem. I mean, it's always difficult to jumpstart markets. I think we've seen with the ADUs, for example, there's been a couple companies who've gotten into that game. It's been slow, but it's starting to pick up a little bit. So, that's certainly something that maybe the Housing Commission and the county can look at over the next few years. But there's only so much, governments can do to kind of jumpstart markets other than, direct intervention, subsidies, things that I don't think we're necessarily interested in doing at this point. But so that was just that came up, and I think we talk a lot about incentives. And my view is we need to make the plan probably as flexible as possible, but that certainly doesn't mean that the market will just jumpstart overnight. There's other factors that weigh in, and maybe that's something that we can weigh in on over the next few years. That's it. Thank you, Eric.
So I think for option 2, it looks like 2A is the preferred option for the commission. It sounds like we have consensus. If anyone, disagrees or has a comment, happy to entertain that now. And as Eric said, we are going to take a vote on kind of a slate. So, people are also able to officially weigh in at that point. But for the sake of time, I'd like to move on to option 3, if we could now, which is the sites larger than 1 acre.
So option 3 is one where actually with the board's action, there's only one option, and it's the more expansive option. This relates to the sites larger than 1 acre. the options were either to not allow EHO at all on these sites or to allow them. These are larger sites that would usually likely result in multiple buildings. And so there'd be a use permit process that would go to the county board for those. So there's only one option here.
Okay. And sorry, you said the option is to allow like the maximum amount of like plexes on those properties and have the regular site plan process for something different?
It would be to allow them on sites of a larger acre where, let's say there's a house of worship and it has a parking lot or something like that. That it could today, if it's zoned R6 or something, it could subdivide, it could sell that parking lot, assuming it can meet its parking needs on another site or something. It could sell that parking lot. It could subdivide. It could build single detached houses under the current zoning. This option would allow that same thing to happen with EHO. So you could have multiple semi-detached or multiple fourplexes on that building. But because it's not just one infill site on a block, it would likely have higher impacts. And so there would be a use permit process where that would be reviewed by there would be public hearings and it would go to the county board.
Okay. Eric, your hand is raised. And I guess you put your hand down. So,
can you hear me now?
Oh, yep. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. Sorry about that. This is what happens. You have to switch rooms because you have kids you try to hide. I personally would prefer us maybe not to take a position on this, or I'm not necessarily in favor of this. And I know that kind of cuts against some of the flexibility arguments that I've made, but I seem to recall, Matt, at the ZOCO meetings, like, yeah, you had said basically like sites that meet this criteria are typically churches in low-rise residential neighborhoods. There's not like a ton of them in the county. And I would kind of prefer that these sites, they're big enough. They probably would be better suited to go through like a site plan process or something with a little bit more engagement and have a little bit more opportunity for the community to kind of shape something other than maybe some really, really just large townhouses. I don't know. I feel like it's big enough where I kind of feel like it's beyond maybe the scope of what we meant to do with Missing Middle. And also, I sincerely doubt there's majority support for this option myself.
So Eric, thanks for your comments. I think in my understanding of it though, that, and staff, please correct me if I'm wrong, but instead of just saying that single family homes can be built on these, sites larger than 1 acre, we're saying you can do Missing Middle with this process. It's not quite by right, but it does not preclude you from doing a site plan to build something different. But if the board did not approve this, it still allows, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong, it would still allow property owners to build single family homes on that lot by right.
That's correct.
Okay, but just not Missing Middle homes.
Right, there'd have to be county board approval for a Missing Middle project.
Okay. Then in this case, Eric, I think I disagree with you. I think it doesn't make sense to me to stick with the status quo, which I feel like favors detached single family homes, where you could get the density for Missing Middle properties. So yeah, I think I disagree on this. Other thoughts from commissioners? It is also an option, as I said at the beginning, that we can take no position on something. So if we have disagreement or, people don't feel strongly, we can just not weigh in on a particular number. Laura.
I'll admit, I don't completely understand this option. It sounds like we would have to approve it in order for missing middle projects to go forward on these larger size lots, but I may be completely wrong on that. Can someone just really simply, in real simple language, explain this option?
Staff, do you mind?
It's just explaining what it is.
Yeah, just explaining it again, like what's allowed today versus what this option would allow if it were adopted.
Well, so let's say there's a 2-acre site. It's it's an institutional use, or it's just there are some houses in Arlington that are on 2-acre lots, and not many of them. But you could subdivide that 2 acres into, say 5 or 10 lots and redevelop the site. And today, if it's R zone, the only thing you can do is single detached houses. So you could build 5 houses or 10 houses or whatever the zoning standard is for laying out lots and laying out a development like that in terms of lot width and lot size. And so what this option is saying is you couldn't by right build EHO, build 4-plexes or 6-plexes on each of those lots that you subdivided, but you could do it if you submitted a use permit, which is a special exception that gets gets an extra level of review and has to be approved by the county board.
Okay, why would the extra level so Eric, you were saying the extra level of review is required just because we're talking about sort of like a size it's an exceptional size, but it goes against the the greater flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak to it. I'm not quite totally comfortable with it, but I also don't feel strongly enough about it to stand in the way. I think that one of the unspoken kind of understandings in the community conversation is that these lots are, lots that you typically see, single family homes already on or would presumably be built on. And like in all practical purposes, like lots of this size probably have a church on them or something. And I just think that's a little different than lots that currently have single family houses on them. I think there's a little bit of a social contract, with that type of building in a neighborhood. And I think reasonable people can disagree about that. But I also think like if that's going to get turned over, the whole reason behind this scheme is that we limit kind of the community involvement so that we reduce costs so that there's more certainty for folks who want to do this. They don't have to go through a whole big process that takes a year. And I think that makes sense for a missing middle. That's kind of the point. I think when it's a lot that it's this big, and if it's a church or something, like I think that kind of does make more sense to have a community conversation. And I think that maybe we do want to kind of, yes, they could build single family homes, but maybe we do kind of want to incentivize them to consider maybe more scaled up housing options if that would be something that would be allowed, or if there was like a zoning change. So I'm just not quite sure. I think it's kind of on the edge of what we kind of contemplated with the scope of what the idea of missing middle housing is. But like I said, I don't feel strongly enough to like try to stand in its way either. That's just kind of where I landed.
Okay, I appreciate that. Can the staff tell us how many of these? I'm curious now. Do you happen to know what kind of property these large lots, what's actually on them?
Yeah, there's about 130 or so of them, so it's not a lot. It's not something that we expect that we would see, but also something that we wanted to think about because they do have the zoning to do something different. So they have a right today if House of Worship were to downsize or downscale or sell their property, they could sell to a developer and a developer could subdivide and build something by right. So I think the conversation here is a good one. I would respond to Commissioner Berkey that the purpose of the use permit process is that there would be some sort of community conversation. And so that, that's why this is not proposed to be allowed by right. And that it would, by requiring county board approval, the county board would want to see some community engagement around that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the additional information, Matthew. And yeah, I think I don't quite see the concern that that Eric has raised about this, because to me it's, the status quo is a developer's either going to build single family homes, or they can go through a site plan process and build something much bigger. What this does is it gives them the option. They can still do single family homes if they want, but if they want to do missing middle, they go through the wasn't site plan, but it was called, was it site review? Sorry, Matt, I'm forgetting the term you just used. But
it's a use permit, and we could, we have public processes for other use permits, like the UCMUD, the Unified Commercial Mixed Use District. Sometimes the SPRC will review those.
Thank you. So it makes it slightly easier to build missing middle housing on these sites, but it still requires a public process. And if the developer does want something different, like a 10-story apartment building, they would still have to go through a site plan process. So I think the only thing this does is make it a little bit easier to build missing middle, but it still requires more steps than the by right process to build single family homes. So I guess I just don't really see, if you're supporting more missing middle housing across the county, I still don't see the issue with this one. But any other thoughts or questions from other commissioners on this item?
I mean, I'll just, I don't want to stand in the way of all this. I think we should move on. But it's the incentive, this is the same sort of conversation that we had with the Columbia Pike. There were form-based code amendments, this is like, 2 years ago now, to incentivize home ownership. And it is about, when you provide, zoning is all about, you use restrictions in a way to kind of incentivize the types of housing that you want to see. And that was done here in an exclusionary way. My thought is that if you allow that, you may not want to necessarily see missing middle on that site, because you might want more denser housing if that's something that's feasible. But reasonable people can disagree. I don't want to hold up the meeting about this. I just that's where I landed. It's not about trying to prevent housing from being built. It's just that size of lots of a certain size, the county, from a policy standpoint, might actually want more dense housing, and you might want to try to force a developer to kind of consider that versus single family homes might really not be as financially viable, if depending upon how big the site is. But it's all good. We should probably move on.
Okay. I'm wondering for this one whether we should just do a vote on this specific item to see whether or not the commission supports it. Just because we've only had 3 speakers from the commission, so I don't have a great understanding of whether there's consensus, since one was against, and it sounded like myself and Laura were in favor. So are people prepared for a vote on this, or am I going to get a lot of abstentions?
I'm prepared for it.
Okay, yeah. Let's go ahead and vote. And this is not an official vote. This is more of a just internal vote to get a sense of where we are so we can move on. So we're not officially approving a motion, but getting a sense of the commission. The question is, do you support the one option that's available, which is to allow the use permit process on sites larger than 1 acre to build missing middle housing, or do you not support it, which would be voting no. So vote yes if you do support the option that's available, and no if you do not. So let's start with Commissioner Berkey.
I vote no.
Commissioner Blake.
Oh, yes.
Commissioner Brown.
No.
Commissioner Edwards.
I think what I want is no, correct? Based on the explanation.
That only you can determine how you want to vote on that.
Well, I want to make it as flexible as possible.
I would say voting yes would make it as flexible as possible.
Yes, yep.
Okay. Commissioner Heminger. Commissioner Heminger, are you there? Okay, he may have stepped away. Commissioner Lee. Commissioner Lee? Nope. Okay. Then Commissioner Macbeth, I vote yes. Commissioner McIlvray?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Montgomery?
Yes.
Commissioner Norris? Let's see if Commissioner Norris is on. Nope, I do not see her. Okay. And Commissioner Rubalcava?
Yes.
Okay, and Commissioner Surface?
Yes.
Okay, so that passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 2 no. So yeah, I think the sentiment is to move ahead with supporting the option 3A. Okay, thank you all. So number 4, lot coverage allowances. And so for this one, it essentially provides the ability, if you guys could pull up the slide, 4B would allow you to take what currently provides like bonus density for doing a garage and allows you to reallocate that for the missing middle housing that would be built on that property, and understanding that garages are likely not to be built for a lot of these multiplexes. And someone correct me if I explained that incorrectly, but that is my understanding of it. So I look at this as basically providing a 5% bonus for missing middle properties when it comes to the lot coverage. And I support that. Other thoughts from commissioners or questions? Yes, Eric.
I mean, I'm still pretty conflicted about this one. Having more flexibility for housing types is something that I am definitely interested in. And I also think that we really should be encouraging a more transit, friendly community. But the reality is that we still live in a very car-centric world, and we do, need to deal with the realities of folks driving cars, and what those impacts will be is always hard to forecast. And so parking is such a pain to kind of talk about. And I'm just I don't know where I'm landing. Somebody convince me. I'm very conflicted on this one because street parking is kind of a reasonable concern in a lot of neighborhoods. So I don't know. I'm interested in what other folks think. I'm pretty conflicted myself.
Question for staff on this. Does this impact only the garage itself, or does it also have an impact on like driveways?
Yeah, so I think to what Commissioner Berkey's getting to, this has no bearing on parking requirements. It's just whether the parking that is built is within a driveway or within a garage that's attached to the main building, or whether it's in a garage that's detached from the main building and in the backyard. So I think, the discussion about parking is the next one. And I think based on the comments I just heard, maybe that's the appropriate place for this conversation. This is really about currently, if you build a single detached house, You're given an extra 5% lot coverage allowance if you build a rear detached garage. There are reasons that was put in place 20 or so years ago. And I think, you know, based on some of the public comments that we heard earlier, it's just a question of, is that form of development the right form for missing middle housing? Are we likely to see a lot of detached garages in the back of a property, or are they more likely to be, you know, attached maybe as a side-loaded garage integrated into the building?
Right, and I understand it's not. I understand it's different. I wasn't trying to conflate it with the actual the parking requirements. It's more. It's taking away the incentive for the garage and putting it back into the base is what I'm struggling with.
Okay.
And Eric, the concern about that is what specifically?
I mean, it you know, the concern is, I mean, it is related to parking, which we'll be talking about next. That I wasn't around, you know, 20, 30 years ago in Arlington, but, you know, I presume one of the ideas was to incentivize folks to have garages so that they would store their cars, you know, off street and house them, right? But, you know, I don't know. I mean, I also, where I'm conflicted is ultimately like we want more flexibility for housing. And do we want to be incentivizing, you know, garages? That really wasn't the intent of this, you know, policy either. So, like I said, I'm kind of conflicted. It's really only because option 4B takes that incentive off the table, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, you're, you know, it's what Matt was talking about, which is the types of developments you want to incentivize. You have to think about that kind of going forward. And so it is this kind of, where I'm struggling is, it is this kind of tension of like a lot of the framework is trying to replicate a lot of the standards we have for current single family homes, but we do have to keep this eye like on the future as far as like the types of development that we want to see in the county going forward for, you know, for our environment, you know, for walkability, livability, all these other reasons. And so there's like a little bit of a tension there, because when you do things that kind of walk away a little bit from what are the current standards for single family homes, like it's, you know, there's a little bit of a tension in that. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think that's probably where my struggle is a little bit, because it's different. You're removing kind of that incentive there. But I mean, I could probably easily see myself supporting option 4B as well. So I don't know. That was pretty incoherent, but that's kind of a summary of my struggle on this.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think for me, this is one of the only things within this package that actually provides an incentive for missing middle housing over a single family home, which is part of, to me, why this is so important is that, you know, with a single family home, you get the extra 5% if you are going to build a detached garage, whereas missing middle, basically it's like you can build slightly bigger with that 5% that would have gone to a garage for a single family home, and now that can be actually used for living space. So to me, that's significant, because there's really not any other incentives in this package for like multiplexes over single family homes. And I think as a result, we're still going to see a lot of single family homes being built and not that many missing middles properties, at least initially. But Paul, I'm willing to recognize you if you have a comment on this.
It was more of a question. Does 4B require that the allowed coverage be reallocated to the base, or could a detached garage still be constructed?
You could still, right, you could still, it doesn't say you can't build a detached garage. It just, you know, removes that allowance that you get for it and reallocates it to the base.
Well, wait a minute. So the garage counts toward the total coverage, and
yes.
And the currently you get 5% in your base building with the garage or no?
I'm going to use the R6 zoning as an example because the lot coverage percentages vary by zoning district. But R6 has a base lot coverage of 40%. If you build a front porch, you can get an extra 3%, so you can go to 43%. If you build a rear detached garage and a front porch, you can go up to 48%. You get 3% for the porch, 5% for the garage. And so what this would say is under 4A, it would be just as I described it. In order to get 48%, you'd need to build a porch and a garage. Under 4B, we would take that 5% from the garage and add it to and reallocate it to the base. So your base lot coverage would be 45% from 40%. And then if you provide a porch, you still have the 3% to get up to the 48%. So the total is the same, but the difference is we're not requiring you to build the rear detached garage in order to access the maximum.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts from commissioners on 4A or 4B, where people are landing on this one? Karen, go ahead.
I just kind of have gotten confused about what the definition of a garage is, because today I talked to a neighbor who said that her neighbor put in a bathroom in a garage. So what is the definition of a garage?
Well, a garage is supposed to be used for parking a car. And if your neighbor has adequate parking elsewhere on the site, then you can, I don't know, that's a question for the zoning administrator, whether that's allowed. But you know, you're supposed to be parking cars in garages, not putting bathtubs in them.
Thanks.
Thank you. Nikki?
Thanks, Kellen. I think this is one where like we need to think about the future a little bit. You know, as we move to greater ride sharing and Arlington's expanding transportation, I'm just not sure. I mean, I hear the concerns about parking. I do think they're very legitimate as well, but I think that in the future that they may be less so. And when we think about the long-standing effects policy can have, this is one where I think about like we really need to consider the future and how this will impact that. So that's just what I wanted to say. Thanks.
And Nikki, are you leaning towards one option versus the other?
Yeah, I would lean toward 4B.
Thank you. Other commissioners, it'd be helpful to get a sense of where people are on this, so we can see if we need to take another vote or if we can move on to the next one. Anika and then Laura.
I'm still in the middle. I'm initially was going towards 4B, but now I'm looking back at 4A after hearing Eric speak. Something he said that made me relook at 4A. And then especially when Nikki also just said about looking towards the future. Let me get the rest of my thoughts together, but I'm in the middle, but I might go back to 4A. So go ahead with the next commissioner. I was just giving you like where I was at.
Okay, thank you. Laura?
I think Nikki said it best because that's where I was leaning to, is looking to the future, and I'm leaning towards 4B.
Okay. Eric, your hand is up.
I'm good with 4B.
Okay. I'm gonna take a vote on this one just so that we can get a clear sense of where people are. So I guess we'll start with 4B. If you support 4B, then you're voting yes. If you do not support 4B, you're voting no. Starting with Commissioner Berkey.
So I vote yes in favor of 4B.
Thank you. Commissioner Blake.
Yes to 4B.
Commissioner Brown.
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards.
Yes, 4B.
Commissioner Heminger.
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Lee is, I don't think, here. Commissioner Macbeth votes yes. Commissioner McGilvray.
I'm going to abstain just because I'm too conflicted.
Okay. Commissioner Montgomery.
I might abstain, but you know, I am conflicted too. I'm just gonna go with my original 4B. Just go ahead, 4B.
Okay. Commissioner Norris, I don't think it was here. And then Commissioner Rubalcava.
Yes, for 4B.
Okay, Commissioner Surface.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, that is all for 4B with one abstention. So I think that helps with clarity for that option. So let's move on to 5, which is parking requirements. If you could bring up the different options for 5. Okay. So for 5, my preference is 5C, which is for transit-oriented areas. It's allowing, instead of just 1 space per unit, half a space per unit. And then all the other areas would be 1 space per unit. And again, if I'm getting this wrong, staff, please correct me. And I also, as an additional option, I don't have an option, or I don't have an issue with 5E. But happy to open it up to other commissioners on their thoughts or questions related to parking. It looks like Laura.
I have a question. Can somebody explain to me the difference between a premium and a primary transit network?
Yes, and I think I actually have a backup slide that shows where these are. But basically, the premium and primary networks are they're defined in the master transportation plan, which is the county's long range plan for all transportation. And so the primary is Columbia Pike is the transit corridor, and then also Crystal City, Pentagon City, Potomac Yard, the transit way there. So that's where we have the highest level of bus service on those 2 corridors. And then the primary transit network is, and again, I can show the map, but it's basically where we have high frequency buses that come at headways of 10 or 12 minutes. It's the county's policy in our transportation plan to focus transit investments along those corridors. And so it covers some of the major corridors that don't have, but I think it would be helpful for me to find that backup slide. You can keep talking while I do that.
Sounds good. Thank you, Laura. Did you have other questions or comments, or was that it for now?
That was it for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Brown and Blake, is your hand raised from before, or did you want to speak about this item? Okay, then I think next is Commissioner Berkey. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, Matt, could you just walk through 5B? And I'm still not understanding. Like, I understand that it would remove the parking survey requirement, but I'm still not understanding what 5B is.
So five, the way that this works, and I'll actually just, because I'm not able to find that other slide, I'll just share this one again. So 5A and 5C here are our base options, right? So one of these has to get adopted, or some combination or something, that basically says this is the parking requirement for all of these EHO uses. And then 5B and 5E would be layered on top of that. And so what 5B is basically like a variation on either 5A or 5C, whichever one gets adopted, because both of these have the possibility of, if you're not transit proximate, if you're far away from transit, your requirement is 1 space per unit. But then recognizing that in some of these neighborhoods far from transit, they're very wide lots, there's very low utilization of on-street parking. And so in our master transportation plan, one of the policies is to actually encourage the use of on-street parking. And so the parking survey option would say there's a process, and it's run by the Department of Environmental Services, and they will actually go out a certain number of times over a certain period, and survey the block and see how many people are parking on the block. And if that's below 65%, then those sites would be eligible for parking reduction. So for maybe for a fourplex, instead of requiring 4 spaces, they'd only be required to provide 2 spaces on site. And then other cars could park on the street because they've demonstrated that there's adequate capacity on that street. Now that's a little complicated. Builders may not want to do that. It would be an extra onerous process. It would take some time. So 5B would basically say you can't do that. You can't reduce your parking requirement even if you can demonstrate that there's ample on-street parking. Your parking requirement is your parking requirement. If you're required to have 1 space per unit, you have to provide 1 space per unit.
Thanks, Matt. So basically, like, the county board could say, we'll do 5C, but we're also gonna, 5C plus 5B, I guess is what you're saying.
Right. They could say 5C, but not the parking requirement, or not the
Right.
parking survey.
So they could choose to do 5B and 5E as well here with the curb cut modification.
Right. And that's why these are laid out the way they are, with base options and then other ones that can be layered on top of it. They could adopt either 5A or 5C. And then on top of that, 5B and 5E, or neither.
Yeah, so Colin, I'll throw the floor back to you. I mean, I would be interested in us pursuing 5C similarly, and with 5B as well. This is something that I know I had asked Matt about, like in Zoco, and I know the county board had asked about at the request to advertise session. And I think that there's some concern about kind of that parking survey process and kind of the length of time it may take. I do want to credit the fact that staff from, I think it was DES, Matt, but basically staff is confident that they would be able to do the parking survey, but it would take at least several weeks, if not maybe a month or so. I might be misquoting the time frame there. So, staff capacity, it needs to be a concern, because it's a process, and less certainty could create a costlier process, which is kind of antithetical to what we're trying to do here. So I maybe would consider that as well. I'll throw it back to you, Kellen.
Thank you, Eric. And I think Anika, you're up next.
Not sure if this is the gentleman who can answer this both, but the parking in this particular area for the middle missing homes and I noticed it in my neighborhood, parking meters do they consider this when they're doing all the planning as far as what area they implement? Because it's so random on which neighborhoods that they put the parking meters. And as far as middle missing homes, would they have to have those type of meters in their particular areas, being that some of those areas that they will be getting into don't already have them?
So I may have to check in with our transportation staff on a specific answer to that, but I would say, in general, parking meters tend to be in the higher density areas. I'm sure that there's exceptions to that. Like I know there's parking meters around the hospital, and there's a residential area around the hospital. So, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the single detached zoned areas, R5 to R20 that we're talking about, don't have a lot of metered parking today. And I think at the level of density that we're talking about here, it's unlikely that that would be a need in the future. Now, there's also the residential permit parking process, which is separate from whether it's metered, but that's the program where a neighborhood can request to have residential parking only.
Okay, because if you're having if families live there, 9 and 10, they probably have 2 vehicles. So just want to make sure that because if you're only allotting 1 parking spot per unit or whatnot, just take into consideration. I may be just thinking too far ahead, but I was just curious about that.
And that's a good question. I do want to clarify that these are parking minimum requirements. And so if there's a demand for more than 1 space per unit, it wouldn't preclude that from happening. A builder could build more parking as long as it fits on the site.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, are you still there? You're on mute if you're speaking.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So I'm a little contrarian here, but I think I'm leaning towards 4 or option A, because it does allow for the option for parking reduction. And it sounds to me like the process is ministerial or administrative and doesn't involve any sort of policy or political decisions, which are the real risks. And is not necessarily subject to veto by your neighbors. So I'd like to hear more about it, but I think I'm leaning toward option A.
And Matthew, sorry to ask, can you bring up the list of options again, just to make it clear? I know you just found this and put this up.
And I've seen it on the ABC, so thank you for showing that. I got it now. It clarified what I understood. So thank you.
Good. Yes. And thank you for Russell for putting up the transit network map. So you can see it's like Langston Boulevard is a primary network. Some portions of Glebe Road. Okay, and I'll go back to sharing my screen.
I appreciate that. Thank you. It was helpful.
And Paul, just clarification, you said that you were supporting 5A, and I, as I was trying to think of which option you were talking about, I think I lost what you were, your explanation for that.
Well, I was just saying that I think it is important to provide some recognizing that this housing is intended for families, or is at least in part, and recognizing, as we heard at the most recent Housing Commission meeting, that people need cars. So I think it's important to provide some minimum, and allowing for the reduction allowing for parking reduction with a administrative process that, even if it is a couple months, it is transparent and clear, I think provides the opportunity to vary downward from the required parking in certain situations. So it does provide flexibility. So I think 5A provides enough flexibility in my mind.
Thank you, Paul. And just clarifying again, so for 5C, when it says transit proximate sites, is that including the Metro, 3/4 mile from Metro, the premium transit, and the primary transit, or just some of those?
Right. So 5C, if you want to know what that is, it's everything that's under 5A except here where it says 0.5 spaces per unit. It would be no parking requirement on this top line is 5C. So we just didn't repeat it because it's the same except for that one element.
Okay. And I did receive a comment from Doris about parking. And she said, I would suggest language allowing a vehicle as accommodation for a person with a disability with the zoning is for half of a space. It needs to be explicit. Can you address that, how that comes into play if someone, does have an accommodation need? Does this allow for under each or any of the options to potentially well, I guess that would be after it's built.
I'm not sure I have enough information to answer that question. Like if a space needed to be enlarged after the fact, I'm not sure how we handle that today, but I can check in on that.
Doris, did you have any follow-up on that? Do you want
Well, I was, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was asking basically if you only get to have 0.5 of a vehicle and somebody in the household needs at least one space for an accessible vehicle because they may not be able, they might be living in a neighborhood where they can't reach public transit, or the neighborhood isn't very accessible, it's on hills or something, that they're going to need that vehicle at least some, if not all of the time. So if this proposal means that some of the units, say in a 4-plex or 6-plex, are not going to be able to have a parking space, that might become a problem, depending on particularly if it's rental and people come in and out, so you have to be prepared perhaps for more than one space.
But, and I think the way that we think about this is that, some people have, every household has a certain need for whatever parking spaces they need. Some households don't own a car, don't have a need for a car, don't have a need for a parking space. Some households have one car, some households have 2 cars, and people will, in the market, choose a housing option that provides the amount of parking that meets their specific needs. And so
but if you're stuck with one of the accessible units, then you've got a conflict,
Well, yeah, I think that's something we'd need to look into as to how those units get allocated. If there's not one space for every unit, how is it determined which people within the building have access to a space? But again, that would be known before someone moves in. And so if you're...
Would Paul's proposal to go for 5A solve that?
I think it's, this is all talking about basically how much parking is built at the time of the permit. And so that's how much parking is built before anyone has moved in. And so it's sort of setting how much parking is available. Just like we have sites in the high-rise corridors where, most of our high-rise multifamily development doesn't provide one space per unit. It provides some amount less than that. And then, some people don't have cars, or they, maybe find a garage in the next building over and rent a space there, or, they find some way to meet their parking needs. But if you are a person who needs a parking space and there's not a unit that's available that provides a parking space, you're just going to find a different housing situation.
I don't think so. Not if you're looking for accessible and you know, in the deal, whether it's purchase or whatever, for you know, you want to be part of whatever advantages the missing middle provides for you to be in a single family neighborhood, which is basically unavailable to you unless you've got massive amount of money to spend on accessibility modifications to whatever unit you pick.
So Doris, both 5A and 5C for the non-transit proximate sites require one space per unit. So for the other areas, like on that map that were not, you know, either the premium or primary or, you know, within 3/4 of a mile from Metro, it would still require one space per unit. So if you have a 6+, that's 6 spaces, you know, total. Under option A, it's half a space per unit. So if you have a duplex, that's 1 space for the total property. If you have a 6-plex, that's, you know, 3. Again, that's a minimum, not necessarily a maximum. But then for A, it's essentially saying because you're within a certain distance of a certain transit network, that no parking requirement should be needed for the property. So the difference between 5A and 5C is only when it comes to the transit proximate sites. They both treat all other sites in the county the same, and they both require 1 parking spot per unit.
But if I'm living near Metro, I may have a lot of reasons. For example, if I'm a wheelchair user, to go out to someplace like Rockville to get my wheelchair repaired, or, you know, I mean, that's a real live example of why, because I brought this up also when they were changing the parking standards, and I'm not even really, you know, for developments near Metro or Metro quarters or prime quarters. So so I just think it applies here, and I thought I was hearing that A would have some kind of administrative process, and while I was hearing that, I was thinking, shouldn't there be some possibility in the zoning requirements for accommodation? So that's what I was thinking. That was what was in my head. I don't know how to solve it for whether, you know, you guys could support something like that.
So 5A doesn't, as far as I know, have an administrative, you know, process or requirement associated with it. It would just, you know, be for transitory parking. You have to do a minimum of 0.5 spaces.
I heard something that Paul said. I thought Paul said it. Yeah. Okay.
I see. Eric, go ahead.
Well, for 5A, you would still need to do the parking study, right, Matt, in order to get that reduction to no fewer than 0.5 spaces.
Right. That's the administrative process that Paul was talking about. Is it's administrative for the parking survey. That's not something it's not a public process around the parking survey. It's either there is 65% of you know, it's either less than 65% of the block is parked in terms of on-street parking, or more than 65% is parked. And if it's more than 65% administratively, you can't reduce the parking. And if less than 65%, you can reduce it to 0.5.
Then I misunderstood. My apologies.
Kellen, I do want to weigh in here. I really respect what Paul's saying. I suspect if the board leaned into the direction of closer to 5C, which I don't think, just personally think they'll adopt 5C as written. I think that's a consideration I'm thinking of too. And, part of the elephant in the room, right, is if we don't have to build parking, then in some of these sites that are transit adjacent or, really meet any one of these three criterias, then that certainly could give more flexibility to build the housing types we've been talking about. And, I think these three site location criterias, I think this is a good place for us to start. And if we can lean into no minimum requirement, if you meet one of those site locations and, the board can give that strong consideration, I think that leans us in the direction of, of maximum flexibility.
Thank you, Eric. So I feel like we've talked a lot about 5A and 5C and gotten some helpful clarification on that. As far as the additional options, 5B and 5E, do people have additional questions or comments on those and what their impact is? Go ahead, Nikki.
I'm sorry to belabor. I don't really understand 5B. Like, does it make 5A more flexible or less flexible if you add on 5B?
5B would make 5C and 5A less flexible.
Okay, thanks.
And Matthew, sorry to belabor this as well. So for 5A, like your by right option for parking in the transit proximate sites is not 0.5 spaces. That requires a parking survey in order to get down to 0.5.
The parking survey only applies for non-transit proximate. So you can go from 1 to as low as 0.5 in non-transit proximate with the parking survey. And then 5B would take that away.
Okay.
So that it would just be, it's basically this bullet under 5A would be struck through.
Okay.
With 5B.
That's what I thought. And I thought that Paul and Eric were saying that the 0.5 requires an administrative process to get to that. Okay, so the 0.5 spaces per unit in transit proximate sites is by right. That's correct, Matthew?
Yes.
Okay. And the non-transit proximate and cul-de-sac sites are 1 space per unit, but if 5B is not adopted, they're able to use a parking study to potentially go lower than 1 space per unit.
Yes.
Okay. Can you provide a little bit of explanation around 5E?
5E is something that actually came out of the was recommended by the Planning Commission and the Transportation Commission, and so it's a little bit complicated, and it would apply in, I think, very few circumstances. But basically, sometimes there's an older house that doesn't have a curb cut today. It doesn't have a driveway. It doesn't have any parking, right? It was built before there was a parking requirement. And so if one of those sites were to redevelop, say as a duplex, where the parking space requirement would, say it's a transit proximate site, it's a duplex, so it's 2 units, its parking requirement is 0.5 spaces, so it's only required to provide 1 space. If they built a new curb cut where there wasn't one previously, they would actually take away, in some cases, an on-street parking space in order to create an off-street parking space. And so the Planning Commission and the Transportation Commission thought that that was a kind of an unfair situation to be taking away a public space to create a private space. And so that's basically the circumstance that this is covering, is saying if you're in that rare circumstance, you don't have a parking requirement.
Okay, Thank you. Okay, I think it would probably be helpful to do a vote to get a sense of the commission on this, this one as well. And this will actually require a couple votes. So, okay. For the first vote then, I would propose that it's binary choice between 5A and 5C. And we'll say if you support 5A, vote yes. If you support, or if you don't, which in effect means you support 5C, vote no. So let's start with Commissioner Berkey.
All right, so vote no, that means I support option 5C.
Or we could just do a separate vote for 5C after we finish with 5A, depending on if 5A does not pass, then we could do a separate vote for 5C, or we can just assume if people voted no for 5A that they support 5C.
I'll vote no because I support option 5C.
Okay. Commissioner Blake.
No on 5A.
Okay. Commissioner Brown.
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards.
I'm still thinking. Could you come back to me?
Yes. Commissioner Heminger.
No.
Commissioner Lee is not here. Commissioner Macbeth votes no. Commissioner McGilvray.
No.
Commissioner Montgomery.
No.
Commissioner Haley Norris is not here. Commissioner Rubalcava.
Yes.
And Commissioner Surface.
No.
And going back to Commissioner Edwards.
No.
Okay. So 5A fails. So that's 2 in favor and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 opposed. So just people, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you voted no, my assumption is that you support 5C. If anyone does not, please, tell me now. Okay. So then I think it makes sense to do separate votes on 5B and 5E because we could potentially adopt both or either or none, if that works for people. Okay, so for 5B, Commissioner Berkey.
I vote no.
Okay, Commissioner Blake.
No.
Commissioner Brown.
No.
Commissioner Edwards.
No.
Commissioner Heminger.
No.
And I vote no as well. Commissioner McGilvray.
No.
Commissioner Montgomery.
No.
Commissioner Norris is not here. Commissioner Rubalcava.
No.
And Commissioner Surface.
Wow, I'm the outlier, yes, because of where I live and there's only parking on one side of the street. Those surveys are really helpful, but.
So 5B eliminates the survey. If you vote yes, you're voting to eliminate the survey. So just clarifying. Okay.
So I guess I got it the wrong way. Sorry. So
okay. Would you like to change your vote to a yes?
Back to the yes. Yes. Sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. I got confused.
This is very complicated. So this is a complicated series of things.
Wait.
Kelly?
Yeah, I think it's a no.
Helen, is that right?
It's a no.
I'm confused.
So, yeah, basically, if you voted no, you're saying that you do not support eliminating the opportunity for a reduction with a parking survey. So you do not want parking surveys if you voted no. If you want, or sorry, you do not want to eliminate the parking survey if you voted no. If you voted yes, you're saying, I do not want parking surveys that could potentially reduce parking further from what was up above. Was everyone clear on that? Because again, that wasn't like a
No, that's right.
vote, so
That's right, Kelly.
Helen,
I
you
think
just
I
mean
think you have that right.
if you vote no, you want to keep the parking surveys.
correct.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
you want to keep, Laura, you want to keep the ability for the reduction,
Yeah.
which is accompanied by the parking survey.
That's exactly what I mean. Thank you.
Okay, got it.
Sounds good.
All right, Kellen,
Yes.
just to confirm my vote, it was a, oh my gosh. I think it was a majority. I do not want to eliminate the opportunity for the
To
parking.
do the parking survey. Yep. Yeah. So everyone voted no.
Okay,
um,
okay, thank you.
With Commissioner Surface changing her vote. Okay. Sounds good. So that means we're not proposing that the board adopt option 5B. So the next one, option 5E. So this is the very complicated situation that does not apply to most, I guess, circumstances that Matthew had explained. Are there any additional questions on this before we vote on whether whether to approve the no minimum parking requirement if a new / expanded curb cut would result in loss of equivalent number of on-street parking spaces? Okay. So this is.
Helen, I think folks are generally, I'm getting bad feedback. So I think folks are probably generally in favor of this. I would propose that if we do vote to support this, that we, have language about basically we talked about, the equity concerns that I think the Transportation Commission had raised. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. So let's start with the voting on 5E. So if you're voting in favor of having the board adopt this option, this additional option, then please vote yes. So Commissioner Berkey?
I vote yes.
Commissioner Blake?
Yes.
Commissioner Brown?
Yes.
Okay, Commissioner Edwards?
Yes.
Commissioner Heminger?
Yes.
And Commissioner Macbeth votes yes. Commissioner McIlvray?
No.
Commissioner Montgomery?
Yes.
Commissioner Rubalcava?
Yes.
Okay, Commissioner Surface?
Yes.
Sounds good. And do we also want to include in our discussion, and I think we can talk about some of the concerns that Doris raised about, especially for units that are accessible, which it sounds like because of the Fair Housing Act, if you're above 4 units, potentially there's requirements there. But do we want to include something about the parking and accessibility?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, Kellen. I don't know that we had enough of a discussion about it. And I just also am not, I really respect what Doris was saying, but I also think that I'm speaking for myself here. speaks to Matt's comment earlier about the type of development that we want to see, in the county. And I think that multimodal and how folks get around applies to all. And I'm not wild about kind of encouraging, a lot of car use, contrary to some of my concerns earlier. I know that's kind of contradictory. So I just don't know that we've gone in depth enough on it to really speak in an informed way. But that's my view.
Okay. I mean, we can definitely note the concerns that Doris had raised in the letter, but without sort of including like the sentiment of the full commission on that issue. Okay, I think we can move on from parking. So the next item is item 6. Oh, yep, go ahead, Doris.
Yeah, I think somebody should research the fact that for any person with a disability who needs an accessible vehicle and needs a place to park it, that if it's certainly in a fourplex or above, that and maybe actually yes, and even if it's well, anyway, if the owner has 4 units or more, that's the point, that you can request accommodation, and parking is very common for an accessible vehicle or parking close to the door or the unit is a common Fair Housing Act, probably the most common request for accommodation. So.
Thank you, Doris. And it certainly, I would encourage staff to look into the concerns and the questions that you raised, as they work on their own recommendation to the board. So definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, if the Fair Housing Act kicks in because of the number of units, then the accommodation of a parking space near the unit is this is a new type of kind of housing that straddles sort of single family and not single family. So what I'm saying is I don't think it should be ignored. I think the county should figure that out. And also the DOJ has enunciated the need for zoning policies not to discriminate against people with disabilities.
Okay, thank you, Doris.
For your letter, okay? So,
yep.
That I hope you will agree to.
Yes, we can definitely include summary of your comments in there and take note of that. Okay, item 6, the tree requirements. So is this are there multiple options, or is it really just 6A for this one?
Yeah, it's just 6A, but I think what I would say is you can see here that there's the language is up to 4, and so the county board has advertised for 2 to 4 units. The requirement could be up to 4 shade trees per site. They would ultimately adopt a number that's between 0 and 4, right? And for 5 to 6 units, they would ultimately adopt a number that is between 0 and 8. So that it gives the board some flexibility within that range. So that, this is the option that's in front of us. But the commission could recommend a number lower than 4 or a number lower than 8, and it would still be in scope.
Does staff have additional information that would be helpful for us in trying to make a recommendation around how many shade trees per site? Like, what are the impacts on, the potential, development of more versus less trees?
This is something we're still evaluating, so I really don't have anything more to share. And other than this isn't something that the commission necessarily needs to weigh in on.
Yeah. Okay. Sarah, your hand is up.
Hi, this might be a silly question, but for these like tree requirements, are they given a list of trees that could go in? Like, I know it says shade trees, but is there a list of actual trees that would fit in that area so it's not spreading like, oh God, I'm not a arborist or anything like that, but just kind of,
There is a list.
okay, there is a list.
So
Okay.
there's a defined list that the Department of Parks and Recreation or the Urban Forestry section maintains. And so it's medium, large native canopy trees in general.
Specifically the name of tree is just, that's kind of more general guidance.
Right, but the shade tree term that's a term that is defined and we maintain a list, and I can or maybe
no,
someone on
that,
my team can find that list and we can put it in the chat so you can see
yeah,
what the trees are.
Yeah, thank you. Again, it probably was really for the question, but just if someone's building something, yes, there are developers, but then there's also like homeowners that are developing too, along with developers. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I saw Eric and then Nikki after Eric.
Yeah, I would recommend that we not take a position on this and move forward. This is one of the more frustrating topics at the ZOCO meetings, and not frustrating because of our staff, just because of the nature of the topic. It's incredibly subjective, and as Matt was saying, they're looking at it, and everybody has a lot of opinions about this, and it certainly has impacts as far as flexibility of the site, but every one of us has seen properties where trees get planted and then they get ripped out, things get clear cut. It's just it's a really difficult issue to kind of get your arms around, and I'm still not confident if we had another year to study it, we'd really still understand what the right move is here. So I kind of would prefer that we just focus on 7, 8, the rest of the options.
Thank you, Eric. Nikki?
Are there tree requirements for single family homes?
So there are, and this is the tricky part of this, is that there's tree requirements for single detached houses. There's tree requirements for pretty much all development in Arlington County, and we regulate that not through the zoning ordinance, which is what we're talking about here, but we regulate it through another ordinance, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance. And it's not a number of trees that you have to plant. There's a calculation of tree canopy that takes into account, what species you're planting and what their maturity will be in 20 years. And so there's like a formula, and that formula is set by state code. And so this is one of these things that, because we're Virginia, Arlington can't change those formulas or can't change those percentages. And actually the way that it's set up is that as density increases, your tree canopy requirements decrease, which maybe makes sense for high-rise development versus single detached development. But we're talking about buildings that are fitting into the same footprint as a single detached house. And so we have this because of the state tells us what the requirements are, and we're actually increasing the dwelling units per acre of the site, even though we're not increasing the size of the building. What that means is most missing middle housing under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance would have a tree canopy requirement of only 10%, where single detached housing has a requirement of 20%. And that is something that, like I said, we have no control over that, except that we can try to get some parity. I think the goal here is try to not have 10% tree canopy. And so the intent is to require through the zoning ordinance an additional layer of tree planting to get some parity between single detached, and missing middle housing types, so that you're not seeing less tree canopy on the missing middle housing types. But it's a different formula. It's a different way that you calculate it. And so there's no way to get exact parity. It's just, we kind of have to get the closest we can get.
Really helpful. Thank you.
And Matthew, is there a reason why this isn't using the same formula? Is that because the county legally cannot require 20%, but they can require individual trees per site?
That's correct.
The wonders of our state code. Okay. Thank you. I think, Margaret, I saw your hand up. If you still had a question.
You asked my same question, so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my personal view on this is, I think at least one would be good. More trees, better for the environment, better for, people, better for, heating or not heating, but for cooling during the summer. But I don't know what the right number is. And I don't think I have enough information to be able to say, what that is. So per Eric's recommendation, I think if people want, we can include a sentiment about, we would like as much tree canopy as makes sense. And, we are pro tree, without specifically taking a position on this, the specific item. Are people in agreement with that, or people would like to have the Housing Commission weigh in on a specific number of trees per unit size? Laura?
I like your suggestion.
I like what you just suggested, that instead of weighing in on a specific number, we express support for, like trees and the maximum number that the experts would recommend, depending on the site and the number of units, whatever the magic formula is. That we express support for as many trees as is practicable and recommended by the experts.
Sounds good. Is everyone else on the commission okay with that approach?
Kellen, I am. This is Sarah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, Sarah. I thought your hand was still up from before. I didn't realize. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Okay. Then I think we can move on to number 7, which is the annual development cap. If you could pull up the slide for 7. Okay. So basically, this is whether or not to set a cap and the type of cap on how many missing middle buildings, or as this puts it, permits can be issued per year. I favor 7B, no cap. I think we want more missing middle, not McMansions, and I don't think we should set a cap. There's no cap on tear downs and building McMansions in Arlington, and I don't think there should be a cap on missing middle, which is definitely, in my view, preferable to giant single family homes for one household. But 7A just sets a permanent cap that of course the board could undo with a separate action. But 7C sets the same cap of 58 permits, but it would automatically sunset after 2028. Margaret.
So I had a question for staff. I could have sworn at one point there had been some discussion about limitations on either, the number of developments on a block, or something that would, limit an entire block or neighborhood going multifamily. So if you can refresh my memory on what I was thinking about, and if there was discussion on it, where that ended up.
Yeah, so there were some discussions in the fall about what we were calling geographic caps, I guess, rather than say if the number is 58, 58 permits countywide across 27,000, give or take, R5 to R20 lots. Maybe drilling down so that situation that you described didn't happen. We were advised by the county attorney that really the only way that we could set caps by geography legally it would be to do it by our existing zoning districts. So the five, R5, R6, R8, R10, and R20. And so it's possible, and something that the commission could weigh in on as to whether that's something that they would support or not. It's still within the scope of advertisement that the board could take 58 or whatever the number ends up being. It would have to be a number lower than 58 to be consistent with the scope of advertisement. But let's say for discussion purposes, it's 58. How are we going to divide that among these 5 zoning districts so that they each have a cap that maybe collectively add up to 58?
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and then Mike.
Thanks, Kellen. So 2 questions for you, Matt. So yeah, and I'm glad that you spoke to the methods of distribution, which is the language in 7A and 7C there. So my understanding, and this is just like a rough ballpark, but a lot of residential lots, yeah, I don't know what the plurality is, but I mean a lot of them are really R5, R6, right? I mean that's not a majority, but that's maybe like a plurality of what
I
we're
think I
talking
have a
about here.
slide. There's
Do you have a
2/3
slide
of
on
them
that?
are, yeah, 2/3 of them are R6 and fewer of
Okay.
them are R5 than you think.
Okay.
Let me see. I hope I put that slide in here.
Okay.
There we go.
Wow. Okay.
So you're right that most of this is R6. And then next most prevalent is R10 at 18%. And then you've got R5 is about 9% of lots. R8 is about 6%. You can see, R8 is kind of along the Langston Boulevard corridor. And then R10 is pretty much all north of the Langston Boulevard corridor. And then Arlington Ridge is also R10. And then R20 is mostly along the river.
Okay. So
And there's only
follow-up.
about 300 or so R20 lots.
Right. I took a look at those. Yeah, exactly. There's just very few. So I guess, and then this is just going to be an obviously stupid question, but, in order to make modifications, like if the county board said, okay, you know what, we're going to do a cap, we're going to do a cap of 58, let's pick option 7A, and then we're going to decide, this many per year for R5, this many for R8, and so on and so forth. The only way to change that is to reopen the zoning ordinance here, basically, right?
Correct.
Right. So that's my concern.
Unless it sunsets. Sorry.
Unless it sunsets, yeah, under 7C. My second question for you about the sunset. So the board advertised a sunset under 7C where the cap would sunset in 2028. That's a maximum of 5 years. But is it possible for the sunset to be less than 5 years, or is it just 5 years or no sunset at all?
Yeah, I think it would be in scope to do anything less than 5 years and not more than 5 years.
Okay. So I'm going to throw a couple ideas on the table for the commission. There might be a lot of folks in the commission who favor 7B, which is not having any cap at all. I think that we should really weigh in though on the cap, because my sense is that there's a pretty decent likelihood that we will see some type of cap, regardless of how we feel about that. I think that very well may be the case. And so it's important that we weigh in these specifics. So I would recommend that we consider recommending a sunset of 3 years as opposed to 5. So that would be calendar years. So my proposal would be to take option 7C, But for it to read during the calendar years 2023, 2024, 2025. I believe that's right. So no 27, no 28. So that would be kind of my first revision. The second revision would be that basically the method of distribution for the permits would be not to have one. I am concerned about trying to figure out, which zoning districts should be allocated certain numbers. And if we don't know how this is going to play out anyway, we're going from a cap and then we're going to even much smaller caps depending upon the zoning districts. And the only way to change them would be to, I guess, either wait for the sunset to expire, which would take several years, or to reopen this whole thing. So that makes me very concerned about this distributing them among the zoning districts. That's it. Those are my comments.
Eric, just clarification. So your second suggestion was so adopting the 58 permits per year cap, but not having basically sub caps for each of the zoning districts. It would just be like first come, first serve anywhere.
So I think my full proposal would basically be this. I would recommend that the county board adopt option 7B. In the event that the county board does want to enact some type of cap, then I would recommend that they adopt 7C with the full 58 caps, that they adopt it with a 3 versus 5 year sunset window, and that there essentially be no dictated method of distribution for the permits. That essentially, I guess that would be first come, first serve, basically.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Thanks. I agree with what Commissioner Berkey was saying. I differ just slightly. I think one, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe data has indicated that this will add about 1,000 units across 10 years. And it's also my understanding that there's about 121,000 housing units currently in Arlington. So even across a decade, this change would represent a less than 1% impact to the current housing inventory that we have in Arlington. The second thing is data from AHS has indicated that this would, expanded housing option would be about 1 unit per neighborhood. Next, I also I keep thinking about accessory dwelling unit, and we put in these limits and restrictions, and we ended up creating a lot of extra work for staff, for the consultants, for commissions, really for everyone in the community. We did that for no reason, and I kind of think here we are again, and thousands of hours have been dedicated to this process. And I do wonder if we put in this arbitrary cap, do we end up creating more work for the community as well? And then just lastly, when I think about, if the county board decides to move forward with expanding housing options, we get the green light next month. I would love to hear from staff, but I imagine the first unit we would probably see would probably be about 3 years from now. So, a cap that sunsets in 2028, again, kind of just seems arbitrary because we would only have it in place for 1 to 2 years. So is it worth kind of creating all this additional work? So long story short, I support what Commissioner Berkey said. I personally think that there should be no cap, so I'm leaning towards 7B. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Paul?
Thank you. So are permits by unit or lot? So
permits would be by lot.
So it could be up to 6 units for 1 permit,
right.
Correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Other questions or comments on the development cap?
Kellen, I guess
go ahead, Paul.
I would say I agree with Eric's point that I think there is likely to be a cap of some sort. but I don't. I think that the sunset of 5 years, just because of inertia, is would take a lot of work to undo. So I think a 5-year sunset is reasonable, because I think it is important to provide some time to prove it out and demonstrate that the fears are unfounded. And I don't think that, say, 3 years is sufficient for that. So I, in general, would support 7C.
I'm going to echo Paul on all those fronts as well. So I'm going to be supporting 7C.
Thank you, Margaret. I think this calls for a vote then. So I think the easiest way to do it is just straight up. We can start with, I guess, 7B. And Eric, you have a comment or a question?
Well, with regards to 7C, I just wondered if, like, Margaret or Paul wanted to speak to my idea of suggesting the board not necessarily restrict the permits by zoning district.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, it should be, don't try to micromanage that. Just let it happen. So
I think if correct, maybe staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, the method of distribution, the way it's phrased, at least on the slide, the method of distribution to be determined, leaves it open that the method of distribution could be just countywide, or it could be, so I think I'm fine with it as is, because it leaves maximum flexibility for staff to work it out. But I can go either way. If I'm incorrect, that it does imply that there is some distribution across the R's, then I would not be a proponent for that.
I mean, my understanding is that it's not up to staff. The county board would make this determination in March, how the allocation would occur, right, Matt?
Right, but I think to answer the question that I just heard, countywide is a method of distribution. So that's countywide is an option, by zoning district is an option, and I'm not sure that legally there's another option other than those two.
Okay. I'm fine speaking to, I'm fine if we want to speak to it specifically or keeping silent on it. So.
Thank you, Margaret. Mike?
Yeah, I just have a quick follow-up question. It was my understanding that, expanding housing options would slowly ramp up each year. And I wonder if, staff could comment, has there been an analysis done on how many units we think or expect will happen in the first 5 years?
So we did engage a consultant team of economists to do some financial modeling based on current conditions, or based on 2022 conditions when we did the analysis, and they I think you had referenced 1,000 units over 10 years. Their estimate was about 100 units in 1 year, and they didn't really look at it over a longer span. But it was roughly 19 to 21 projects per year, resulting in 100 units per year. Now, that analysis included the possibility of 8plexes. So, it might end up being reduced from that, particularly from a unit perspective. If the maximum units per project is 6, it's probably would be a lower number of units, maybe not a lower number of projects.
Thanks. So just to confirm, it sounds like 19 to 21 would be, kind of like that baseline. That was the data with 8 plexes. So yeah, I mean, with like 58, it's so far over. I almost wonder if it's even necessary. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mike.
But
And
but just to clarify, the thing that sort of keyed me in was that it's 58 permits, and the permits are by lot. So if you are talking, 6 plexes per lot, that's 6 times 58. Correct?
No, I mean,
Not
a
all of
sixplex
these.
is one, a sixplex is one building on one lot with 6 units. So that would be one permit.
Right, 1 permit, but 6 units.
Right.
So if we're talking units and you had 58 permits, all for which it was 6 plexes, which of course would not be the case, but that would be 6 times 58 for the number of units per year.
I think we're talking about 2 different things, right? One is what is the cap, which is, what is the number at which we should not exceed, and then the other one is based on economic feasibility. What do we think we're likely to see?
Right.
I think, Margaret, maybe your point is with the 58 cap, you could potentially get up to 348 units a year. Okay.
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks for doing the math for me there.
No problem. I have my calculator next to me. So, Paul, did you have a question or comment, or is your hand still up from before?
Sorry, I left it up. I'll put it down.
No worries. And Mike, same question or comment, or hand just still raised?
Yep. Sorry, I'll lower it.
Okay. So I think that, again, the easiest thing to do first is to vote on the 7B, no cap on development. If there is, if that fails, then we can get into the specifics of the other options and the variations of them. So let's see. So for 7B.
Kellen?
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think Eric's point is well taken. I mean, I think many of us would support no cap, but I think we would want to give the county board our position if they decided there should be a cap. So even if 7A passes, or excuse me, 7B passes, we should vote on 7A or the others, I think.
Yes, I'm fine with clarifying sort of what we would want next after that. Mike, yep.
Yeah, I agree. I think here's where my mind's at. If we think the county's already gonna, put a cap, then maybe we use our advisory, influence as the chief advisor on housing, and try to lean towards no cap, right? If we already think the county's going to put a cap, but perhaps in the letter we can say, we favor no cap, but if the county does, then maybe, 7C, I guess that's where I'm at. So it's like best of the worst. I definitely am not in favor of 7A, but if we do have to do a cap, then I guess I can live with 7C, if that makes sense.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think let's vote on 7B, and then we can figure out if it passes, what our next, best option would be for the board. If it fails, then we'll figure out what our actual recommendation is out of the remaining 2 options. So for 7B, which is no cap, Commissioner Berkey.
Yes.
Commissioner Blake.
Yes.
Commissioner Brown.
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards.
Yes.
Commissioner Heminger.
Yes.
Commissioner Macbeth votes yes. Commissioner McGilvray.
Yes.
Commissioner Montgomery. Is Commissioner Montgomery still? We may have lost Commissioner Montgomery. Okay. Commissioner Rubalcava,
Yes.
Commissioner Surface.
Yes.
Okay, so that passes unanimously. So now for our sort of backup option, if the board does not agree with our primary recommendation of no cap on development, I get the sense that people would like a cap with a sunset. So that would be 7C that we would have our next vote on. But we've had several different options about what that would entail. So we have the actual, which is, or the original, which is 5-year sunset. We have Eric's suggestion of a 3-year sunset, and also getting rid of the method of distribution and basically saying that it would be countywide. Getting rid of the county board determining something other than a countywide distribution. But we've also heard of, I think it was mainly the 5 years or the 3 years, and either removing the flexibility of the board to determine the method of distribution or keep going with that. And I saw Eric's hand up.
I mean, like, let's just do 5, and my suggestion of countywide distribution, and we can see how many folks support that, so we can move things along here. I would prefer 3, but I take Paul's point very strongly. Also, just practically speaking, this seems to be an area of the policy where there's going to be a good deal of horse trading by the county board members, right? So maybe my recommendation is let's vote on 7C as written, but with the distribution to be countywide.
Thank you, Eric. Mike?
Yeah, I will withdraw I was just going to support Eric's 3. I think I'm just thinking about the tiering, right? If the county says, all right, yeah, we do need a cap, and they're already going to go with 5, let's push them to 3. And if we lose 3, then we get 5. But I hear what Commissioner Berkey's saying. So yeah, let's just go with 5 for now.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mike, and it's 10 o'clock, and also I think I don't have any doubt that the county board is going to understand kind of where we're at, and this is there's going to be a lot of compromise here. So
okay, so we can take a vote on as a backup option the cap of 58 permits per year, with the cap sunsetting after 5 years. And the method of distribution would be specified as countywide. If you do not support any part of that, and you feel strongly, you can vote no, and then we can reopen it up and see what other changes people want to make. But if you support that combination, please vote yes. Okay, so for D7C, Commissioner Berkey.
I vote yes.
Commissioner Blake.
Abstain.
Commissioner Brown.
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards.
Yes.
Commissioner Heminger.
Yes, if 7B is no.
Okay. Commissioner Macbeth votes yes. Commissioner McGilvray.
Yes.
Commissioner Montgomery is not here. Commissioner Rubalcava.
Yes.
And Commissioner Surface.
Yes.
Okay, so that passes as our backup option, with the 5-year sunset, but the countywide distribution method. So we will put that in the letter as a backup option if the board wants to do a cap. Okay, the joys of, as the meeting gets later and later into the evening, how much more people are willing to compromise. Let's move on to number 8, which is non-conforming building rental to ownership, which was not part of the presentation. Do people feel that we should take a position on this? I do not actually have a position myself on this.
I don't think we need to take a position on this.
Any other thoughts on taking a position on non-conforming building rental to ownership?
I don't have a position on this.
Can we see the slide?
I don't believe there is a slide. Oh, is there a slide related to this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I guess it just wasn't part of the presentation we had
so
earlier.
there is a slide, and to the extent that anything on missing middle can be non-controversial, this is the thing that's non-controversial. I don't know that it's necessary to take a position on this.
Is this just basically restating county policy?
It's basically the current requirement would be 8B, where again, if you have a non-conforming dwelling and you are converting it from, let's say you have a single detached house and it is built under 1940 setbacks, so it doesn't meet the setbacks. If you convert it into a duplex and then you want to convert that into a condo, under current policy, you would have to get a use permit from the county board. And option 8A is saying you shouldn't have to get a use permit from the county board in that situation. I don't know how applicable that situation is going to be. It's probably a pretty rare case. But we have not heard any advocacy through, for pretty much everybody that we've engaged with so far has supported 8A. There's not really constituency for 8B.
Well, 8A would be in line with if you want maximum flexibility to create more missing middle housing.
I mean, 8A basically prevents one less barrier to home ownership opportunities, and 8B provides a little bit of a barrier to home ownership opportunities.
Okay, so is there any objection to moving on to 9 and not taking a position on 8? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to 9, which is definition of duplex. So this is also one that I do not have a position on, but Matthew, if you want to provide a quick summary.
Right, so there's a definition in the zoning ordinance of every housing type. There's a definition of what's a townhouse, what's a multifamily dwelling, what's a duplex. And so a duplex is actually, it's when there's 2 units and they're up and down, one on the bottom and one on the top, rather than if they're side by side, that's technically called semi-detached. And the current definition of a duplex says that you can only have one front entrance. So you couldn't have a door that goes into the first floor unit and then a door facing the street that goes up the stairs to a second floor unit. That's not allowed. The door has to be like on a side entrance or something. And then there's this other standard in the current definition that says a duplex has to have all exterior characteristics of a one-family attached dwelling. And that's a very subjective standard. So the thinking is that that could be removed so that we have objective standards in our zoning ordinance. And so that's basically what it is. And then 9A would keep the definition of a duplex as it is.
Matthew,
again,
is this one also
that
non-controversial?
Yeah, this is one that we haven't gotten a lot of engagement on.
Okay. I mean, to me, 9B makes sense, but again, I don't know that the commission necessarily needs to weigh in on this. Any strong sense from other commissioners that we should weigh in on this one? Go ahead, Sarah.
I know it's late. My thinking is just to remove the really subjective requirement and make it more objective in the ordinance, just for the ease of it. That's just kind of my stance. That's it.
Okay. thank you. Eric?
Couldn't state it better than Sarah did. I do think we should weigh in, and I would strongly support option 9B. One of the very few discussion items that I'm remembering from ZOCO was essentially the confusion, as Matt was explaining, about really what is a duplex and how that is actually in the ordinance. And I would like to see us provide more flexibility, but also remove stigma from having these types of dwellings, because to me, that's a lot of the reason why this was in the ordinance in the first place. And so I'd like to see us lean into another direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Is there any objection to supporting 9B?
None whatsoever.
Okay,
Nope.
hearing none.
No, I said no. No objection to
Okay.
9B.
Sounds good. Then we will include support for 9B in the letter. And let's move on to 10, which is the applicability in zoning districts. If you could pull that up.
And so this is another one that reflects that would affect a very small number of properties, only about 136 throughout the county. But we do have areas, and like I said, and it's only 136 properties, where we have a plan in place and existing zoning tools that overlap with our zoning, mostly R5 and R6 zoning. And so there are about 80 or so properties within the Columbia Pike corridor that are zoned R5 or R6 and are also eligible to redevelop under the form-based code. And so, and similar with the Cherrydale, there are zoning tools there. And in East Falls Church, it's just like a couple of properties. And so the question is, if we already have a plan in place and there are existing zoning tools, albeit zoning tools that are not by right and would require, a larger effort than doing an EHO project because they would likely require county board approval. But should we allow EHO in those areas, or should we exempt them from EHO to try to incentivize or give priority to our existing plans and our existing zoning tools?
Thank you, Matthew. I think for this one, my instinct is to support option 10B, which would allow missing middle housing in these club designated planning districts. Other thoughts from commissioners or questions about this one? Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I didn't hear a ton, but there were a few folks who had specifically mentioned Cherrydale. And so, yeah, it wouldn't affect a ton of properties. But on the other hand, like we're opening up the zoning ordinance, and so it's like, why wouldn't we do this here? And I think it's always worth discussing whether we should be overriding other plans that we've kind of put in place. But missing middle study was for countywide, and I think if we can help more lots in some of these neighborhoods that because of the way they're designated they weren't covered under their kind of the original framework, I say let's do it. I mean, we're already opening up the zoning ordinance, so we might as well make sure that it's an effective plan.
Thank you, Eric. Other thoughts on this one or questions?
I'm for 10B.
Thank you. Is there any objection to us moving forward with supporting option 10B?
Not for me.
Okay, hearing none, then then we will go with supporting 10B in our letter. Next one, 11, is gross floor area. You could pull that up. Okay, so for this one, essentially it's setting maximum sizes for units of certain sizes. So this is slightly different than what I was looking at elsewhere, but basically both options set maximum sizes for, I believe it's up to, is it 3 plexes or 4 plexes?
I can walk through this one.
Yep, that would be helpful, just to, yeah.
Okay, so
Thank you.
11A would set a maximum gross floor area for all EHO development from 2 up to 6 units. It's a graduated scale. The numbers are, the exact figures are in the staff report from the RTA. They're the same ones that were in the phase 2 framework. So, they've been out in the community for about 9 months now. But 4,800 total building size if you have 2 units, and then up to 8,000 square foot total building size if you have 6 units, or 5 or 6 units. And then option 11B would be only to set a maximum gross floor area for semi-detached, which is 2 units side by side, and that would be 5,000 square foot total for the 2 units. Or for townhouses, which would be 3 units side by side, and it's 7,500 square feet total across those 3 units. And then for all the other housing types, duplexes and multiplexes, there would be no gross floor area limit under 11B. And I know last time we went to Housing Commission, I think in the summer, there was a lot of support to not set a gross floor area standard. We also heard that from the Planning Commission. And so there was an option 11C that was recommended by staff for advertisement that would not regulate floor area for EHO. The county board took that out and so didn't advertise that option.
And Matthew, can you speak a little bit as to why the county is looking at limiting the floor area and what they see as the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, so I think the pros of limiting the floor area are, one is if you look at 11A, you get more building, you're allowed more building area as you have more units. And so it's trying to incentivize building more units, which, helps with our supply issue and also, helps with our, our issue of having a range of options available in neighborhoods where there aren't a range of options available. And I think we've heard from, and the other advantage of it is it does, in areas where you can build a very large building because it's a very large lot. I saw there was a comment earlier, I think in the public comments of, someone lives in a neighborhood and none of the houses are 8,000 square feet. And, that's probably because the zoning doesn't allow an 8,000 square foot building in that area. So this doesn't override all of the other standards, but it says if you can build 8,000 square feet with the height and setbacks and lot coverage and main building footprint and all the other zoning standards, you can build 5 or 6 units up to 8,000 square feet, but you can't build a building larger than that. And that's sort of in keeping with the concerns that we've heard in the community about compatibility with existing development patterns. And we don't see a lot, even in the very largest houses, very few of them are larger than 8,000 square feet. So it is trying to put some limit on what can be built. Again, responding to concerns that we've heard in the community about very large buildings. 11B is recognizing the fact that, we heard loud and clear from the Housing Commission and the Planning Commission, they didn't like that there was this extra requirement. We already have height limits, we already have setback requirements, we don't need an extra layer limiting what can be built. So we heard that, and 11B was an option to sort of create a compromise, because the other concern that we've heard is that we have had some semi-detached projects built recently, not very many, but also townhouse projects where individual units are coming in at 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 square feet. They're 6-bedroom houses, and that's not really creating options that don't exist in our neighborhoods. That's just creating more 5- and 6-bedroom houses, but they're attached to each other. And so the thinking behind the limits here would be, we would limit it to an average of 2,500 square feet, which is a very generous sized unit for semi-detached and for townhouse units, but not necessarily excessive. So I hope that gives a little bit of the rationale there.
Thank you, Matthew. I think my concern with the limits, especially in 11A, because they both have limits, but 11A has more, is just the trade-off for developers. If the limits are going to make them lean more towards doing a single family home versus missing middle, even a duplex. A big duplex is still, in my view, better than like a McMansion, and is likely to become more affordable over time. But I understand what staff is trying to get at as far as putting limits on to try to, incentivize smaller, more affordable units in the development. Thoughts from other commissioners? Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I've struggled with this one, and I've had this conversation with Matt at prior meetings, and he's given that explanation about trying to incentivize the smaller units, and I wasn't sure about that. I might have flipped on that a little bit, only because maybe this is an area where, like, I'm not sure if that's the case, but maybe we try it and we see if having some of those limits, and so I think I'm speaking to 11B here, we see if that works over this 5-year period. I don't know. I would have preferred that the board advertise 11C. They didn't. So I'm persuaded to maybe, I think it's 11B you were talking about, Matt. I'm persuaded to give that a chance and see how that works.
Thanks, Eric. Thoughts from other commissioners? Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I would just repeat what I said before. I'm not really in favor of any area limitations, so I wouldn't vote for, I think, A or B.
So, Paul, your opinion or your preference would be to basically say, the board has to pick one of these options, right? Matthew? They don't have the option of not going with a limit at this point because they didn't advertise that. You're on mute.
I think even if it was in scope, the fact that they proactively took it out of scope, I think signals where the board is on this.
Yeah. So, Paul,
okay.
Given that there's only two options, do you have a preference for one of them?
I suppose 11B says applies to fewer building types.
Thank you. And any other thoughts from commissioners?
Kellen, we also just don't have to take a vote on this one. We could just we could describe the discussion, and we could not take a vote either if folks don't feel strongly.
I mean, I prefer 11B as well, but go ahead, Laura.
Is this a similar situation to in the past where we didn't see an option before us that more of us agree on, but we felt like we had to like give some guidance because of what was put before us? If that's the case, I'd like to put before the commission that we express support. You know, we would have preferred that the request to advertise did not put limits on the maximum floor size, maximum gross floor area, but since they did, we kind of, you know, like are willing to give 11B a chance.
That works for me, Laura. If it seems like that is at least the sentiment of those who have spoken. Is there any? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I said I think that's what I'm hearing too.
Yeah. Is there any objection to recommending to the county board 11B, but also stating that, you know, basically we're disappointed they took 11C off the table and that we would prefer, you know, no limits, but given the two options, we would recommend 11B.
I would rather not take a vote. Oops, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, lead with we're disappointed they took 11C off the table, but since they did, we're going to kind of reluctantly go with 11B and see how it goes.
Mike?
Yeah, I think maybe we shouldn't take a vote because I'm kind of no on both as well. I know that they only have two options, but I'd rather just not take a position if we didn't have to.
Okay, I mean, we can take a vote to see if people would not like to take a position on this one, and at least determine if people do want to take a position or if they don't.
No, Kellen, can I interject here?
Go ahead, Eric.
So let's do this. Let's take why don't we take a vote on 11B? And I think this is an area where an abstention really would be appropriate if you have the position that Mike holds, where basically I don't like either option on the table, and then we can explain that in the letter. And maybe that's a cleaner way just to do it. We can have the vote on 11B, and then those who don't think that we should vote at all can abstain.
I'm fine with that. Nikki, I think I saw your hand up briefly.
I think I'm okay with what Eric just said, I guess. I mean, I like Commissioner Lara's idea, but it's late.
It's late, yeah. Let's go with Eric's idea. Let's just do it.
Okay. Sorry, go
Could
ahead.
Darth make a suggestion?
Yes.
Okay, because I actually was in favor of Paul's position on this and not setting limits for a number of reasons. But what about saying, because we are reluctant about this and we had supported no limit, we would like to put a sunset on that and have it reconsidered, because one of the things that I recall was, and Paul can say if I'm wrong, that the space limit would constrain developers, and so that's what I'm suggesting. That because if there had to be a reconsideration, that's telling them that y'all don't really think that this is a good idea, but you'd like them to reassess it.
Thank you, Doris. Matthew, is that an option for the board to add a sunset provision to this, or is that not something that they can do at this point?
I think that would be out of scope. But if it's something that you feel strongly on, you could recommend that, and then we could check with the county attorney as to whether it's in scope.
Okay. I think what makes sense is to take a vote on 11B, and we can try to incorporate any specific comments. Again, the letter is going to go out to all the commissioners to review, and if people have language that they feel like is not in there around this, expressing disappointment in what the options were, or why we think that this is not the best approach, we can massage that at the time. But I think going through and taking a vote on 11B makes the most sense right now. So if you support 11B, and this does not mean that we're not going to add additional language that says, but we preferred 5C or we prefer something different. But do you support 11B as the recommendation to the board? Commissioner Berkey?
Yes.
Commissioner Blake?
Yes, I guess.
Okay, I just want to reiterate what Commissioner Berkey had recommended, as far as like, if you want to show your strong disapproval of both options, you can also abstain, and that will be recorded. That will be recorded in the letter that we had a lot of people who did not support it as well.
Okay, then yeah.
Abstain.
Yes, thank you.
Commissioner Brown?
Abstain.
Commissioner Edwards?
Gosh. So I'm sorry if this is repetitive, but I really want to make sure I'm recorded correctly. If I could say no here, and that means that really I wish they'd had 11C. Correct?
Yes. If you say no, though, and it does not pass, then and if people do not support 11A, then we're essentially not taking a position on either of the two options that the board has before them.
Got it. Abstain.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Heminger?
Abstain.
Commissioner Macbeth votes yes. Commissioner McGilvray?
I'm in favor of 11B.
Okay.
Or I'm voting yes for 11B.
I think Commissioner Montgomery is no longer here.
I'm here.
Oh, you're back. Okay.
I abstain.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Commissioner Rubalcava?
Yes, for 11B.
And Commissioner Surface?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So that passes with 5 yeses and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 abstentions. So we'll note in the letter that there was a lot of people who were unhappy with the two options that were presented, even though the commission officially would come out in favor of option B. And we can, as I said, if people have specific language that they want to add that is not in the draft, they'll be able to add that in to the letter, and we can go through that. Hopefully are we good to move on from 11 to 12?
Yep.
Sounds great. Super exciting. Second to the last one. Okay, accessory dwellings. If you could pull up the slide. Okay, so 12A essentially says if you do missing middle units, you can't have an accessory dwelling on the property. 12B would allow accessory dwellings in some circumstances. So I support 12B, which is allowing accessory dwellings in the limited circumstances. Thoughts from or questions from other commissioners?
I support 12B.
Thanks, Mike. Other thoughts or questions for staff?
I'm okay with 12B.
Thank you.
Yeah. Same here, Helen. Yeah, 12B.
I'm okay with it too. Laura here.
Okay.
Yeah, 12,
Any of, oh, go
12,
ahead.
12B.
Okay.
Nope, just I was
Any,
gonna say, I'm in favor, so.
any objection to 12B? Okay, sounds good. Some rapid progress. Okay, and lastly, we just have, if we want to take a position on the GLUP amendments, or the language. So I think we should come out in support of it in the letter. You know, there's no options, it's just supporting the language as advertised. Questions or comments from commissioners on this?
Nope, I think we should recommend it as is.
Okay, it sounds like we have consensus on supporting the GLUP amendments. And so I did want to, since we got through the different options as well as the GLUP amendment question, I did want to provide an opportunity if there are other things that commissioners would like to include in the letter. One of the things that I've thought about is, you know, expressing, we've already talked about expressing disapproval over and disappointment over the removal of 7 and 8plexes from the RTA, but also recommending to the county board that they look at in the future, including or allowing 7 and 8plexes that are, if they're going to be committed affordable or you know, attainable home ownership opportunities, like through Habitat or some other thing like that, that they either develop a special expedited process or, you know, yeah, it would just be a special expedited process to have that happen in the same footprint that they would allow the rest of these missing middle units.
It's late. I'm sorry. I missed part of that. Can you say that again?
Yep. So essentially, since they removed 7 and 8s, it would be a recommendation that the county consider in the future creating a process by which either like committed affordable 7 and 8plex units or attainable home ownership units would be able to be built on these the same lots that, you know, like let's say they adopt 6plexes, that 6plexes would be allowed, but not having to go through the full site plan process. And Eric, you have, go ahead.
If the recommendation were tweaked to say that that maybe that's something that we study, I would be inclined to support it, but I'm less inclined to support it as something that the county should do because I have several concerns. Scale is one of them, and of course that speaks directly to the ordinance, then our affordable housing kind of scheme, and I'm just not sure how that works legally. But if we want to study it, sure, yeah, I would support it. I did want to make the comment too before the meeting ends here that I really feel strongly that the letter should also acknowledge the fact that this was a 3-year process pretty much with many, many hands involved. And I just feel very strongly that the commission should acknowledge all the work that our county staff has done here. We're not the first jurisdiction to pursue missing middle housing, but it's not like there's a ton, and they did a ton of work beginning in summer 2020 and all the way till now. Very contentious public process, a tremendous amount of public engagement, meetings, talking to us. I mean, just long nights. And it wasn't like there was just all these examples around the country for them to draw from. And so, you know, this is a very ambitious plan, and I just feel strongly that we should, you know, acknowledge staff's incredibly hard work. We're very indebted to them for that. That's it.
Thank you, Eric. And I am fine with both points that you raised. So changing it to encouraging them to study, looking at creating a process to support affordable housing, faster development for 7 and 8 plexes on the, same units across the county, as well as acknowledging all the hard work related to missing middle. Mike, you had your hand up. Did you still have?
Yeah, I think Eric already said. I just wasn't sure about the legality of caps. That was all.
Yep. Laura?
I agree with what Eric suggested. And I just want to add to the one point about thanking the staff that in addition to, everything that Eric said, they also did it through the midst of a pandemic. They made it work despite a pandemic.
Definitely agree with that. Any other comments or things to consider before we entertain a motion on our recommendation to the county board on missing middle housing?
Congrats to everybody for getting through it. That was a lot.
Yes. So I have notes of the different options that we have agreed to support sort of in different places. So it's kind of hard for me to read it back to everyone now, but assuming that everyone's okay, this meeting's recorded. I know Alex is diligently taking notes, and I've been taking notes as well of motioning to recommend to the county board that we move forward with the things we've agreed on tonight related to missing middle. I'm happy to entertain that motion.
So moved.
I will make that motion.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. So now the vote that really matters, the final vote. Okay, Commissioner Berkey.
So to be clear, this is basically, the motion is to agree to everything that we voted on, that, yes, basically to the letter that you're going to write.
All the previous votes that we took were really just sense of the commission. So it was to help us figure out what people agreed with and what they didn't. This is the official vote to say, okay, all the things that we've said that we agreed on in this meeting, now we're going to put that in a letter. I see Nikki. Sorry, Nikki has her hand raised before.
Yeah, go ahead and entertain that. Yep.
Sorry. I just because I'm newer and it sounds like it'll be a pretty long letter. Are you going to write the whole thing, or are you going to ask us to write sections, or you need help?
That is a great question that I haven't given a lot of thought to yet during this meeting. But I probably, if people would like to volunteer to help with it, I will happily take their help. And I was also planning to pull from the notes that Alex is taking. So yes, this is very complicated, and I want to make sure, we have everything that people have talked about in the letter. So if people would like to help, certainly I would love to have their help and assistance.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Okay, let us return to the vote. Commissioner Berkey.
I vote yes.
Commissioner Blake.
Yes.
Commissioner Brown. Did we lose Commissioner Brown?
Looks like we did.
Oh, okay. Then Commissioner Edwards.
Yes.
Commissioner Heminger.
Yes.
Commissioner Macbeth votes yes. Commissioner McGilvray.
Yes.
Commissioner Montgomery.
Yes.
And Commissioner Rubalcava.
Yes.
And Commissioner Surface.
Yes.
Okay, that passes unanimously. So I want to thank all of the commissioners and all the staff for your patience and your time spent thinking about this, preparing for this meeting, and going through this very complex zoning ordinance change. And I think this is pretty historic. I think we're the first commission to officially weigh in on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, since the RTA was adopted by the county board. And so hopefully not just the county board, but other commissions will be looking to our letter as well for some sense of at least how, you know, the advisors to the county board on housing feel about missing middle. And I think we have taken a step in the right direction for racial equity and justice as well for the community, and also helping to address our housing supply crisis and needs that we have. This, as I said before, this is not a perfect solution to all the challenges that we have, and there's a lot more that I think we need to do as a community. But I think this is a step in the right direction, and it's going to help address some of our exclusionary zoning and racist zoning policies of the past. So I'm proud of what we were able to accomplish today and recommend to the board. And I'm very grateful for all of you for being a part of that.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you
This is
all.
great.
And Alex, unless there's anything else, I think we are adjourned.
Nothing else for tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Matt, for everything.
Thank you.
I'll send out an email to see if people want to help with the letter.
Sounds great.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you all.
Colin.
Bye.